Damn, girl. Did it hurt when you fell from the peak of the Gaussian distribution curve of desirable female traits? Your symmetrical features tell me there's a good statistical chance you don't have a tapeworm. When you walked into the room, I could tell you were ovulating by your gait. At this time of the month, my scent receptors are enhanced. I can smell your genetic profile. It's compatible with mine. And your waist-to-hip ratio is within the range of 0.7 for childbearing, so I know your offspring will likely reach full term. But if we were to do the deed tonight, what is the statistical probability that the resulting child would be mine? Using Bayes' theorem. Sorry, I'm not naturally gifted in STEM. Well, that's okay. I have very large balls, which means I have a force powerful enough to douche your womb into oblivion. Also, I can use my tongue beforehand to see if I can taste the genes of a rival mate. How would you know what that tastes like? Don't you worry about that. This all sounds like BS, but I have an agreeable nature, so I'll nod along. What tax bracket are you in? Basic rate. You see, feminism forced me to graduate with a master's and now I earn more than you, so I'm gonna go find a mate now with dark triad traits to fuck my problems away, but if you're free to cuckold a child later... God damn it, I am so nostalgic for the Pleistocene! Those are all real theories of human sexual selection from Evolutionary Psychology. Welcome to the Mooncat channel, where you follow me down whatever internet rabbit hole I've been falling down recently, and we slowly go insane together. My research process for this video went a little bit like this. This paper is goofy. By implying there's a natural order to humanity, it serves as a purpose to retain the status quo, benefiting only those who already benefit from it. Evolutionary psychology is kind of stuck in the essentialist scientific era, but the more we learn about ourselves, the more we realise we don't have an essence. Perhaps humankind has actually evolved as a programmatic monolith and every person is a synapse within the social tapestry, just contributing threads of knowledge like droplets in an entropic ocean of reasoning, which will evaporate into the cosmos, and only then will we reach the singularity. So, do you want to join me on this journey? Ooh, nice. Good pour on that one.
Since the caveman days,
hundreds of thousands of years ago,
very difficult for women to overcome hypergamous instinct.
You are biologically wired to be deathly afraid of talking to girls. Social hierarchy.
alpha male caveman,
pulling his ejaculate up to the cervix,
That's built in at a fundamental level.
to the zenith level of orgasm.
dating. She could have my baby.
What Darwin called female choice.
Cryptic female choice.
We all know a guy who has spent a lot of time online and seems to have biological, scientific backing for all their opinions, all of which happen to be centered around Eurocentric beauty standards, 1950s gender roles, and the economic status quo. And then as soon as you try and challenge them or criticize them, all of a sudden you're in your
feelings, you're virtue signaling, you're trying to be politically correct, but they're just looking at the facts, bro.
People seeing culture moving away from a supposed ideal will use varied mechanisms to stop that change. First, they might use the law to restrict the freedom of people moving away from this sort of norm, but once this technique has been vanquished by the progressives, conservatives may turn to more psychological manipulation, basically gaslighting the public into believing things have always been this way for a reason. And the final resort of this psychological manipulation is the misleading use of science. Evolutionary psychology is the perfect tool for this. Social hierarchies exist, but it's okay because your rung on the societal ladder was determined by your genes. There's nothing you can do about it, so accept it. Science itself is in a crisis. It's being mistaken for logic and reason, and academics are in a pit of misleading studies, unreplicated studies, publication bias, manipulated data, and outright fraud carried out by their own peers, and they're scrambling around trying to figure out how to fix it. And meanwhile, it's being communicated to a public who don't know how to engage with it critically. And this mess is being taken advantage of. Political pundits will use small, convenient sections of it as a weapon of truth, and others will use sections of it as a misleading marketing tactic to sell supplements and books. It has never been so lucrative to be a science-backed nutritionist or neuroscientist influencer. Evolutionary psychology is just one of the tools that these people will use to convince you, to fool you, because it sounds plausible. Why not use Evo Psych logic to train people in everyday public speaking skills?
And when we can't see someone's hands, something interesting happens. You should start to feel just a little bit uncomfortable. And the reason for that is because when you can't see my hands, you wonder, what is she doing back there? Because if we were approached by a stranger caveman, the first place we looked was the hands to see if they were carrying a rock or a spear. In other words, we wanted to know if we were safe, if they were friend or foe. Now, this actually still remains from caveman days.
Oh, right, because without that little story about cavemen, I never would have realised that it was weird to do public speaking with your hands behind your back. That's what I've been doing wrong the entire time. Wow, thanks, cavemen.
Now, this is actually a good thing. As humans, this keeps us safe. Dr. Paul Ekman has studied something...
Oh God, no! He's haunting me! No! Why not use evolutionary psychology to train your dog?
You know, you're a caveman back in the caveman days. You think cavemen were hanging out, worrying about clickers? No, they would just get their dogs down and they'd start to grab them and wrestle them and pretend that they were fighting bears and stuff.
Come on. If you got decapitated by a rival tribe, you know your dog would have been first in the queue to hump your severed head. You can use evolutionary psychology to scam people into buying your course on how to be an alpha male.
You'll have access to the sub-knowledge that your mind has, and instead of having to overthink it, and instead of being dragged around by your emotions, you're gonna make decisions and speak from presence. Really what we're accessing here, in my opinion, is what a caveman would have accessed when hunting down a fucking woolly mammoth.
Yabba dabba fucking do! Or if you've ever cursed your irises with Naked Attraction, a British dating show in which participants do dating but backwards and are subjected to the genitals of their prospective mate, then their torso before revealing their personality. Rounds are interspersed with what the latest studies have told us about what humans find attractive, because we can't make up our own minds. No, science will tell us what we like.
It's a very nice curvy figure.
Kieran's among the 81% of men who crave a curvy figure. And women with this ideal waist-to-hip ratio are found to have a lower risk of disease, be more likely to conceive, and even bear more intelligent offspring.
I don't know, if you're looking to mix genes with a guy that you met on a dating show because he wanted to see your genitals before he saw your face, perhaps neither of you are giving yourselves the best chances of conceiving a child who'll join Mensa.
Anthropologist Helen Fisher studies how our bodies and brains have evolved so that boy meets girl. They find that men react differently to women. Men are turned on visually. For women, the ideal mate is more than just a source of fertile sperm.
Oh, really? Well, what if all I want is a source of fertile sperm that I don't ever have to speak to, ever? Never underestimate the wants and desires of a woman in her ape era.
She seeks the more intangible characteristics, such as reliability, loyalty, kindness, that suggest a good husband and a good father for her children.
I'm not looking for a father. I'm looking for daddy.
You called?
Shut up!
She needed to remember what he did last Valentine's Day, what he promised last Christmas, what he didn't do last summer. She needed to remember to see if he was going to be a good husband and a good father. That's what women do all the time. We get on the telephone and talk to other women, constantly recounting what he did and didn't do.
Yeah, he just tried talking to me.
Women are particularly interested in the men's character, and that they build up a memory map of their behavior in order to determine if they will be a suitable mate and father to their children.
What do you want for dinner? I bought us some pizzas from Sainsbury's earlier, and I got us some beer. I also fed the cat. Are you okay?
As a boy reaches puberty, testosterone secreted by the testes promotes the growth of particular masculine features.
Yeah, I'd probably be making a face like that as well if puberty was causing me to be haunted by my own gigantic sperm. Over on the most cursed corner of the internet, YouTube, Evo Psych is most commonly used in the context of giving dating advice, most of the time to men. It can be used to explain why you like big butts so much. It's because you're thinking about your potentially sexy daughters.
Studies show that women with lower waist-to-hip ratio are more likely to bear daughters who would also develop low waist-to-hip ratio. thus making it a heritable trait.
You will like big butts, and you will not lie. You other brothers can't deny.
The reason for this type of sexual preference has to do with bearing children. Specifically, women with wider hips are supposed to bear children with more ease.
When a girl walks in with an itty-bitty waist and a round thing in your face.
Further, females with 45-degree curvature would have had the advantage in foraging during pregnancy, as such body type would prevent them from spinal injuries.
Cool! Someone should tell the 90s, the 60s, and the 20s. Somebody should also tell the era of tuberculosis chic in the 1800s. I'm not sure those women were attempting to depict fertility. Oh, and could somebody go back 30,000 years and tell the makers of the Venus of Willendorf that the artifact they're making actually doesn't conform to 21st century beauty standards? Yeah, it's amazing and everything, but would the guy who made this YouTube video about arses stick his cock in it? Or, I don't know, just use it to dunk on women on your alpha male podcast with facts and logic about why it's okay for men to cheat on them, actually.
Men, we're biologically hardwired for it to not be that serious. Like for men, sex is like taking a piss. I hate to say it like that. So,
The science behind that?
Because clearly, the men watching these podcasts have girlfriends and always have multiple chances to cheat on them.
It's like for survival reasons, it's like just hardwired naturally in our DNA that's what we want.
But don't worry, if it's the other way round and your girlfriend cheated on you, then there's evolutionary explanations for that too.
That is, they're trying to get investment from one guy, like the good dads, but good genes from another guy.
If a man's attached, here's what happens. She'll twist the knife and pull away or try and purposefully hurt you because it proves her hypergamy right that you're now weak for her. When you see a woman lose respect and desire for a man, all morals, all normal human behavior goes completely out the window. The primal instinct kicks in and she's just like, oh, weak man, do not want his genes, do not want him to procreate, do not want him to carry on. Goodbye.
Men will literally fill an entire 120 by 90 whiteboard with armchair evolutionary psychology instead of going to therapy.
She could be the smartest woman on the planet, and then when she's going to make a sexual decision, it's a chimpanzee that takes over. It's a primal brain, and it's just like flinging poo and throwing her vagina out there. Like, it's just, it doesn't have it. It's like, you know, and then they're like, what happened to me? I don't even know what I'm doing, right? That's most women. So that person, her opinion of you is garbage, you know?
I don't know, Paul Apex mindset. I'm sorry that happened to you, but maybe her prefrontal cortex was active, and maybe she wasn't some kind of shaved ape woman, and she just didn't like you that much. Try jerking off instead of recording a podcast next time. We even use the elusive caveman lifestyle to legitimize fad diets.
Many of the foods we're eating today, our bodies really aren't genetically designed to eat.
We evolved to eat lots and lots of meat.
Primal! Primal! We only eat primal!
Nutrition is out of the scope of this video, but just for posterity, this is all bullshit too.
I've done steroids.
Much of this is people falling victim to naturalistic fallacy, a tendency to believe anything deemed natural is good, but what natural even means can really be called into question. I mean, a banana looks nothing like it did before we started cloning them, and I mean, I don't know, I quite like having shelter and a computer and healthcare, but cyanide isn't great. Well, let's rewind the clock a bit and figure out where this all started. 164 years ago, the Father Christmas of evolution, Charles Darwin, produced his seminal work. I always think that sounds a little bit like a euphemism for jizzing. On the origin of species. It cast a new light on the way we view humankind, not as this divine creation summoned into existence by some intangible, mysterious deity, but as a product of millions and millions of years of random genetic mutations naturally selected to develop beings suited, like perhaps imperfectly, but in a sort of equilibrium to their environments. It wasn't this bearded white guy from the Bible saying, make the most perfect animal that ever existed. Now put tiny knives in its hands and have it find joy in bringing twitching half-deceased rodents inside. People realised evolution was actually just Mother Nature being a messy bitch and throwing gene spaghetti at the wall and seeing what would stick.
Penis snake!
And this was a pretty mind-blowing revelation for a lot of people, especially the ones who really liked the God dude. They really wanted to believe, for some reason, that the God dude that they pray to every night was the same guy who thought up this penis snake. But in the world of evolutionary psychologists, in a way, the belief in a deity has sort of returned, but not in the form of a god, but rather an almost godlike perspective of Darwinian evolution, which I, in part, blame Richard Dawkins for.
That thing in her mind that's always looking for the alpha, it can't ever turn off. It's an evolution. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. It is primary for her genetics. If you guys ever read The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, it is primary for her genetics, her genes to pass themselves along.
It's a weird sort of one step up from creationism, this belief that our brains developed alongside the rest of our bodies in this sort of perfect utilitarian manner, which allows us to pass our genes to the next generation in the most efficient way imaginable. Like we're all driverless meatbags programmed by our gonads, and there's this little guy in there at the controls just dictating our every move. Like, don't date that guy, he's low value. How will he support my eggs? Don't date her, her waist to hip ratio is 3 percentage points out. This means she won't be able to cultivate the genes in my spermatozoa to the optimum efficiency. Evolutionary psychology bases its assumptions on the theory that our base traits were established in what is called the EEA. Yes, the European Economic Area. I am joking, you idiots! The EEA in this context is the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, the Pleistocene savanna, which conveniently happened too long ago for any of us to really know what went on. No one was on their phones, everyone was living in the moment, so we happily project current gender norms onto it. Time for a moon history lesson. So, quite a long time ago, all the countries in the world were in one big blob, and all the dinosaurs lived together on it in perfect harmony, until one day the Pharaohsaurus Rex came along with a pint and started talking about certain groups of dinosaurs as if they weren't as good as the other ones, and this made them get all mad at each other, and then they voted for Pangexit. Pangexit created loads of separate continents, including one that they called Africa, named after a hairstyle that hadn't been invented yet, and this is where humans first appeared a few million years ago. Once they'd started living in caves and drew this AI-generated lion orgy on the wall, they all had a meeting and agreed that they'd peaked and they should stop evolving there and then, so that future evolutionary psychologists could call this the environment of evolutionary adaptedness to make their jobs a lot easier to do. The hypotheses that evolutionary psychologists formulate tend to reveal more about the person doing the hypothesizing than about actual humanity. Most evolutionary psychologists hide behind their Google Scholar pages, racking up citations in a perpetual circle jerk with other evolutionary psychologists, but some professors just love the spotlight. Meet Geoffrey Miller. He'll appear in your documentary leaning up against his F-150, exhibiting his accumulated resources for the ladies. Geoffrey appears a relatively meek, soft-spoken man in interviews, which is not what you expect when your first exposure to his viewpoints is via his Twitter feed, on which he goes by the name @PrimalPolly, which just conjures up images of a Neanderthal Zeus surrounded by ovulating cave women lining up for a drop of his prime genetic material.
The funny thing about sexual selection is it's a very powerful evolutionary process, but it's not blind, dumb natural selection. It's driven by our tastes, our pleasure.
Hundreds of thousands of years ago, humans started selecting partners who were more intelligent. As a result, intelligence began to grow in our species.
He spends what seems to be most of his waking hours on Twitter.com just pissing out the hottest takes. He thinks that contraception is the root of all evil, and everyone trying to eradicate ableism, eugenics, and racism from science is a woke ideologue, and he thinks there should be a YouTube channel that teaches feminine beauty tips to young men, not in the name of diversity and challenging fashion norms, no, but actually so when a man goes on a date with a woman, he can judge how long she took to get ready for the date. Then he can know whether the look is smart and classy or not. Geoffrey seems to think he's the originator of the Manosphere, since he was the one talking about the hypergamous nature of women 20 years ago, and he hated women before it was cool, but says it's since run amok with his ideas. He thinks that the red pill is now in its rebellious teenage years, just tacking on extra beliefs like semen retention and making women the enemy.
It was strange to see like second and third hand ideas from like my early work getting kind of recycled into Manosphere. Like wisdom or good advice are often bad advice, and then get into arguments with Manosphere guys who are like, Miller, you don't understand human sexual dynamics at all. And
this is my fucking work.
But you see, lovely meek Geoffrey believes that men should follow their natural, evolved desires, but in a way that respects women. Aw, thanks, Geoffrey.
Getting in touch with your sexuality, your sexual desires, the ways that you view women, trying to make those both consistent with your evolved desires, but also kind of find your ethical path.
I don't know, Geoffrey, why don't you allow your eyes to live consistency with their evolved desires? Why do they have that woke glass over them, distorting their realistic view of the world? Take your glasses off, Geoffrey! He serves as a middleman for incels who think they're too intelligent for the Fresh and Fit or whatever podcast on which there once lived an era of unassuming and sometimes drunk and or underage women being coerced on to be manipulated into giving answers for cathartic takedowns by a host. But this has since morphed into women being fully aware of the scheme, being paid a guest fee, and then making even more money on top of that from the OF signs up, while the milquetoast host is too dumb to realise it's a bit and looks like he probably refuses to stand up at the end of the interview.
I just you and you, I'm sorry, lay you and lay you until, you know, like you're like, oh my God, I have no more inside my body anymore.
But with Geoffrey, we've got a sort of, oh, poor women. They can't help being hypergamous, manipulative cheaters, disgusted by the idea of having sex with you. It's just in their genes. He's also a big fan of the peacock's tail, which you'll find is a bit of a common boon within the Evo Psych community, because of course that's the most grandiose display of sexual selection adaptation for the choosy females. His wife even wore them in her hair on their wedding day. Aww. Geoffrey's wife, Diana Fleischman, the incel's wet dream. She's not like other girls because she's open and honest about what she wants.
Because I'm incredibly emotionally transparent and my facial expression is very transparent. And it doesn't bother me to say exactly what I want. I think many women don't want to say exactly what they want because part of the Q investment that they're looking for is for somebody to use enough cognitive cycles to guess what they want.
She believes Geoffrey is a high status male and feels that it would be selfish of her to keep him to herself. So she decides to let other women enjoy his high status fruits.
I think Geoffrey is wonderful. So in some sense, I would feel guilty monopolizing him entirely, and it's actually very much the kind of utilitarian reasons that I think about it, and most people would not think about things that way.
I must be towards one of the more extreme ends of the Gaussian distribution when the x-axis is labelled female innate propensity to view Geoffrey Miller as high value mate, but each to their own. Someone else can have my slice of the Geoffrey pie. I'm not hungry. They're in a polyamorous relationship because they basically means that humans actually didn't evolve to be monogamous. Monogamy has just been this temporary fix to prevent a pool of incels from running around and starting podcasts. But now, because of feminism, we have that pool of incels running around starting podcasts. And they talk about this a lot on podcasts. Now, I've got nothing against polyamory between consenting parties, although Geoffrey and Diana seem to be doing it because they want to accelerate human evolution by allowing men like Geoffrey with his prime genetics to impregnate multiple women. So if polyamory were the norm, this would supposedly reintroduce sexual competition and increase the genes in the pool that are highly desirable for sexual selection, which is the cringiest reason to be in a polycule. Like, at least join one because you're running a global crypto Ponzi scheme from a penthouse in the Bahamas and you've got money coming out of your ass, so you're bored.
Yeah, you're happy. I think it helps that you're bisexual.
Yeah, it helps a lot that I'm bisexual.
They are the literal embodiment of, hey, my wife and I saw you from across the bar and we really dig your vibe. Can we buy you a drink? Would you like to become a data point in our study on the effects of polyamory within a socio-economic context? Jeffrey's favourite area to discuss is sex differences, a subject on which he has written multiple books, including The Mating Mind, Spent, and Mate, Become the Man Women Want, a book which he wrote with Tucker Max. Remember that guy who made that awful film, I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell? Based on a book of true stories, he wrote about his boozed up escapades and having sexual encounters with women that teeter on the edge of consent.
And talking to the turtles.
Are they telling you to kill that fat girl behind us? Because that's what they're telling me to do. What? How can you be mad about that? Fat girls aren't real people.
You can credit the founding and legitimization of the entire field of evolutionary psychology to John Tooby and his wife Leda Cosmides. John Tooby passed away last year, passing on the baton to Dr. David Buss, someone I touched on quickly in my Manosphere video. He has written multiple books about what he contends are the ingrained differences between the male and female mind, offering the supposed evolutionary framework backing up every unhinged r/red pill post in existence, something which without fail gets him invited to regular appearances on the 3-hour broadcast circle jerk.
What I call the mate switching hypothesis. The mate switching hypothesis. Like mate switching hypothesis. Mate switching hypothesis.
But of course, it's not only sex differences that Evo Psych deals with. It's also sometimes, race differences. Thankfully, this side of evolutionary psychology remains mostly pushed to the fringes of political discourse nowadays. The ones who still believe its claims are at most not openly discussing this in public, and I'd like it to stay that way. So I'm going to be focusing mostly on sexual selection theories and gender differences in psychology, as that's in the mainstream, but the way that I tie this all up in the end is pretty much going to be blowing it all out of the water.
Destroy! Yeah, this girl's for the streets. I got the receipts. A freak in the sheets. A leopard print too. She do what she wanna. Savannah Explorer. She hot like a sauna. She hot in Megapona.
I didn't want to satisfy my lizard cave woman brain ravenous for confirmation bias and flies, so I started to delve into some articles in defense of evolutionary psychology. Yeah, I got a whiteboard for this video. I have a lot of things to teach. Stop passing notes at the back. So Evo Psych is a field which attracts a lot of criticism from other scientists, but a lot of the time for good reason. You might assume that Evo Psychs would say everything is on this end of the spectrum, everything is nature, but they do admit that the environment and culture has heavy impacts on the way that we think and act. And conversely, many academics who are mostly nurture do agree that there's probably certain mechanisms in the brain that are ingrained from birth. The main contention is really where you come down on this nature-nurture spectrum. If you think it's entirely nurture, you're all the way on this end of the spectrum. That's what they call blank slatism. Your brain is essentially a tabula rasa, an entity subject to the experiences it is exposed to from birth. But academics, they tend to get into fights, and there is this tendency for many non-Evo Psych academics to assume that all Evo Psychers think that the brain is entirely molded by the Pleistocene. Either that or Plasticine. I can't remember which. Fuck. But it's not surprising when you read some of their papers and are exposed to the type of language that they use to describe human nature. It's a bit like looking into Sam Bankman-Fried's mind, which seems to be so cooked by affective altruism to the point that he's unable to see anything outside of the myopic perspective of probabilities and equations. It's like this sort of ostensibly dispassionate and algorithmic approach to the well-being of humankind. For example, anyone not absolutely brain broken by Evo Psych would just be like, you know, maybe it's just nice to be nice to other people because we've evolved to be a social species who live in groups who like look after each other. Whereas academics in the field of Evo Psych are like, hey babe, long day at the Evo Psych lab today. It took a while to apply our finding from mice to humans, so I brought you some flowers to say sorry. Oh babe, you didn't have to. Actually, yes I did, because in order to secure the passing of my genes to the next generation, Darwinian evolution evolution provides an explanation for cooperative behavior in which, where W is probability and C is cooperate and D is defect, W exceeds C over B. So if we extrapolate this finding to acts of indirect altruistic reciprocity between strangers, natural selection favors those who adopt these strategies that base the decision to help on the reputation of the recipient. So as you see, but they don't really help themselves when they try to defend their field by saying that they're doing the very thing that other behavioral scientists would say is extremely bad practice. The most common criticism of the field is that it's rife with just so stories, which essentially means an untestable explanation for a theory. And these motherfuckers will come up with anything. Like, they observe gorilla breasts as being flat, but human women breasts are rounded, so this must be, they say, for the pleasure and sexual selection of men to show that they're fertile. So why didn't the gorillas evolve them like that then? And what if women had evolved breasts that are like flat and 3 meters long and they have to unfurl them like Hubba Bubba bubble tape? Well, of course it would be so that they can throw them over their shoulders and keep the cave babies fed while they get impregnated by another cave chad. But the practice of telling just so stories in this field is defended badly. Laith al-Shawaf in this article explains that in evolutionary psychology there's 2 main ways you can generate a hypothesis. You can either use the top-down approach, which is having your theory about human behavior based on knowledge of early civilization and then testing it, or there's the bottom-up approach, which is noticing something about humankind from within current culture, testing this thing you've noticed to see if the data backs it up, and figuring out your evolutionary hypothesis from that, and then generating new theories from the hypothesis you generated from your original.
If you survey the primary literature in evolutionary psychology, you'll notice 2 things. 1, rendering this research essentially immune to the just so charge. And 2, most of the bottom-up evolutionary research does not stop halfway through the process. Rather, the researchers usually generate novel predictions from the hypotheses they just concocted, and proceed to test those novel predictions in new empirical studies. This means that most bottom-up work in evolutionary psychology appears not to fall into the just so storytelling either.
The only difference between bottom up and top down is whether you first thought up the hypothesis because of what you think you know about human behavior in the Pleistocene, or whether you thought up your hypothesis because of something you noticed within modern culture. The very definition of a just so story is something that's untestable, and the very nature of evolutionary psychology renders all hypotheses essentially untestable, because your hypotheses will include the contention that we evolved the trait that we're testing. That bit is the just so story because you literally can't prove it. But what's the rebuttal of this?
It is certain that our ancestors, like other old world primates, nursed, had 2 sexes, chose mates, had color vision calibrated to the spectral properties of sunlight, lived in a biotic environment with predatory cats, venomous snakes, and spiders, were predated on, bled when wounded, were incapacitated from injuries, were vulnerable to a large variety of parasites and pathogens, and had deleterious recessives rendering them subject to inbreeding depression if they mated with siblings.
I mean, this is true, but it's also true of most mammals. It's simply not enough knowledge for us to make the kinds of connections evolutionary psychology makes between its evolutionary predictions and the data it finds. The just so story is when the hypothesis connects the data gathered to something about early humankind that we don't know and will never know, such as how they chose their mates based on behavioral traits, or how they actively avoided pathogens, if they even did, because it might just have been pure luck. A large part of evolutionary psychology is focused on disgust, because there is a belief that it actually underlies a lot of our political affiliations and biases, i.e. you're more likely to be conservative if you're more susceptible to disgust and sensitive to potential pathogens. Like, there is this propensity to avoid foreigners because of the risk of disease. But the science isn't even settled on that. I mean, this study revealed that the feelings of disgust and recognition of others' disgust doesn't start happening until about 5 years of age, meaning it may well be learned. And I mean, have you ever seen a baby piss in its own mouth? They're disgusting little freaks. And when you really delve into the studies behind much of evolutionary psychology, you'll find that the science just doesn't even hold up when you apply even the slightest bit of scrutiny. I'm just gonna pop in a disclaimer here to start. These studies are written by people clearly under the assumption that gender is very binary. I realise that this is not the case, and I will be talking about that more later in the video. I just didn't want you to think throughout the whole thing that I think that way. I don't. I'm just speaking in terms of these studies as they are written.
There had been 100 years of theory-free research looking at spatial cognition in humans, and people kept finding a male advantage on certain kinds of spatial cognition.
One of the most proud findings evolutionary psychology has is the marked gender differences in the ability to rotate images in one's head in favour of men. But it was found that even slightly altering parameters of the test evened out the gender differences. Using more realistic-looking images in the test rather than 3D images rendered onto a 2D plane, such as shadowing or using realistic everyday objects, or even just giving participants a simple 2-week training course, evened out the scores. There's also a psychological phenomenon called stereotype threat. In a separate study, a situational manipulation of social power enhanced mental rotation abilities in women to the point where they were as able as the men, and in another, even just telling the female participants that women excel at these types of tests boosted their confidence enough to perform equally. Unfortunately, this isn't the type of science that makes it into the facts before feelings crowd who like to vent their frustration at vague concepts of wokeness through comparing women to apes.
It's true, we are objectively better at everything. They are true obligate inferiors. To encourage their ambition is cruel because they will fail at everything they attempt without male supervision and leadership. There was a banned study conducted at a left coast university that showed how the female brain is not only incapable of rotating three-dimensional objects in the mind, but it is also incapable of rotating concepts, ideas, and deeper comprehension of all subjects within the female mind's eye. Of course, you're better at household management and childcare than she is. The only thing separating her from the great apes is less hair and vocal cords, and only one of those features benefits us as men, and it ain't her ability to speak.
Well, just for fun, I decided to do one of these tests myself, and guess what? I scored 90%, baby! Like, literally everyone on average is like 67%. Yeah, you ain't gonna threaten me with your bloody stereotype threats. Guess what, bitch? I'm imagining Margaret Thatcher spinning in her grave right now. So if men are the hunters who, for some reason, it's beneficial for them to rotate 3D images in their minds, then women must harbour advantages when it comes to gathering activities, right? So they come up with the hypothesis that maybe, perhaps, women are better at remembering where things are in a certain area.
Some of our colleagues thought, well, what would you need, what kind of spatial cognition would you need to be a good gatherer? And they said, well, you need to remember where things are in a complex array. You need to be able to, plants don't get up and move around, but they might not be fruiting now, they might be fruiting later, so you want to remember that, you want to be able to go straight to one of those patches and so on. And through a series of experiments, right from the beginning, they found the first female advantage that any psychologist had found in spatial cognition.
Gotta remember where those poisonous berries are and tell our mates about it. Remember the Meadow report?
Gatherers have to walk around and figure out where the berries are, where the food is, everything else. And as they're going, they gotta remember it all, because otherwise the bats or the other animals get it. You gotta get it right at the right time or the family doesn't survive. And they're giving you what they learned out there in the meadow. We call it the Meadow report.
Memories. Well, let's look at the data, shall we? Okay, so in this one, it's a pretty large sample size, 250,000 men and women across 40 different cultures. They all took an internet spatial memory test, and women significantly outperformed in 35 of the countries. Okay, and in this one they thought, well, why don't we test this with actual foods? We need to recreate what women would have done when gathering fruits and vegetables in the rolling grasslands of the African savannas. So we'll take them for a walk around a local farmer's market and see how well they remember where all the foods are. Bonus points for remembering the olive oil, because that's the most calorie dense. Because Savannah Neanderthals knew how to make olive oil and bottle it. Well, they did find that women outperformed on that one. Okay, well, we don't want to look at just these two studies, so we'll look at another. Okay, so on this one, we've got a few more testing methods used. Okay, so men are better at rotation and space relations tasks, but women are excelling at object memory and location memory. Okay, so, well, let's check out this one then. Okay, so now women excel in recalling object location, and they really excel by a magnitude of 70% when recalling items and their locations in a natural setting, such as a waiting room, but under the same conditions using objects that were not easily identifiable. Women only excelled when they were under incidental learning conditions, not directed learning conditions, in which men performed better than women. Okay, so let's look at another. Okay, so it turns out during a series of computer-based tests supposed to recreate the gathering process, men outperform women when it comes to search and gathering skills according to single items, multiple items at once, and recall of items previously found in a video game. So this researcher comes to the conclusion that maybe we were wrong all along, and women are actually no better at gathering tasks. They just ended up doing it because the all-round superior men were too busy hunting. Okay, what do the meta-analyses say?
Men are better at all of the visual spatial tests, apart from location memory, but the male advantages are not significant enough to account fully for sex differences in spatial abilities.
Okay, well, what about this meta-analysis?
Well, they thought that the differences might lie in a comparison between small-scale and large-scale spatial abilities, and these guys even used fMRI imaging. The result? Men outperform in everything, especially large-scale spatial abilities. Why? Women's susceptibility to their emotions is messing with one of their brain wrinkles.
The science is in! Women's emotions make them smooth-brained! The bats ate all of the berries and the children are hungry. A mooncat meta-analysis. Okay, so we have proof that men excel in mental 3D rotation and space relations tasks, but women are as good as them if you give them a 2-week training course, or if you use realistic objects, or if you just tell them that they are. And women most often excel in spatial location memory, but only in specific test environments, otherwise men are better. But women are especially better at spatial location memory under incidental test settings and with real-life room settings, but only in small spaces. Don't give them a big space or they'll cry!
But Geoffrey Miller and pals also carried out a study in which they gave women 3D models of penises and then took them away and then asked them to recall what size they were later. And it turned out women were able to do that pretty damn accurately.
So I guess it turns out as soon as the 3D model is of a dick, we're the experts. Okay, so how can we get to the bottom of this? We need to prove that these differences, if there even are any, are wired and not culturally ingrained. Well, we could do that by seeing if they're present in infancy. So this meta-analysis clarifies that these differences only seem to emerge at around 13 to 17 years of age. And this one says that a small male advantage emerges between 6 and 8 years old, which suggests that this could be a cultural phenomenon and not intrinsic. Alright, well, maybe we can get to the absolute bottom of this by looking at infant tests. Okay, well, it seems infant tests are few and far between, and the ones we do have piss poor sample sizes. This one used 20 babies of each sex, and all were from the same area in Australia. And this one used 17 boys and 13 girls. Damn, I guess the trouble is it's kinda difficult to get parents to agree to bring in their infant children for scientific experts. When they do, it's kinda hard to test them anyway because they refuse to talk. They're too busy pissing in their own mouths. But even if we proved beyond any reasonable doubt that spatial abilities between infant children are equal, it still wouldn't convince any evolutionary psychologists.
Teeth and breasts illustrate what is wrong with this principle. They are both adaptations par excellence, but they are not present at birth. Instead, they emerge at the appropriate developmental stage of the organism's life. Natural selection builds adaptations that emerge at the correct point in ontogenic development, not adaptations that are necessarily present at the moment a baby is born.
So basically, girls, your ability to remember where the olive oil is in the farmer's market is your brain's pubic hair. But we don't only gather the olive oil at the farmer's market, no. we also gather victims. This study found that female serial killers are more likely to murder men they are in a relationship with in order to take the man's resources. And this is clearly because of our evolved tendency to gather. How's that for a Meadow report, Tony? Goddamn hypergamous serial killers! But are men hunters? And are women gatherers? Well, this recent meta-analysis of ethnographic studies found that in 80% of hunter-gatherer societies, women are reported to engage in hunting, and in a third of those, women hunt big game. So the entire theoretical framework that these studies are being based on isn't even settled in itself.
And even in the case of this meta-analysis, you have to consider the societies being witnessed are current-day foraging societies, some of which are living in very close proximity to their Western neighbours. It's also a meta-analysis of studies carried out mostly by men from dates as early as 1888 by people from Western countries operating under their own biases that they are likely to project onto societies that they're witnessing for the first time.
If you look at some of the earliest literature focused on foraging societies, such as Man the Hunter from the 60s, you have enlightening quotes such as this.
Human hunting, if done by males, is based on a division of labor and is a social and technical adaptation quite different from that of other mammals. The biology, psychology, and customs that separate us from the apes, all these we owe to the hunters of time past.
Basically implying that all human evolution is thanks to the activities of men. Women are literally described as beasts of burden in this book, at the same level in the hierarchy as the dogs.
Women and dogs have been the principal beasts of burden since Paleolithic times. And these are not universally available for the reason that women are not always at the site of killing and butchering, and many people did not breed dogs suitable for packing.
Among the great inventory of hunting technology is the ancient and widespread boas. Its principle, common to the bull roar sling and centrifuge alike, is simple enough for women and children to manipulate and helps explain some of their substantial contributions to the hunting economy.
Aw, thanks boys for letting us swing your balls with our pathetic little weak arms.
Much of what is said in Man the Hunter is simply based on the assumption that men hunt and women gather, despite the fact that in the memoirs of expeditions that they reference, women are often documented as actively taking part in hunts, but the language they use to describe women's activities is draped in the stereotypes of modern Western nuclear family norms, like, for instance, describing male members of the tribe by name and describing women as a homogeneous group just accompanying male activities. Since the 70s, this presumption has been continually challenged, such as in the book Woman the Gatherer from 1981, but the ideas from Man the Hunter have permeated evolutionary psychology to this day.
I get the point you're trying to make, but I have yet to meet a hetero woman who enthusiastically participates in sex.
Girls, has your man ever prized you apart and eaten you out like he's trying to tongue the last of the flavouring from the crevices of a bag of Monster Munch? And you've looked down to the top of his cute little head and thought, why are you doing this? No. Me neither. But evolutionary psychology has the answer. Apparently, even though they admit a possible explanation could be that men would like to sexually satiate women, it's probably actually because they're trying to detect other men. Like, taste other men. They're supporting evidence. A cited study which concluded that men at greater recurrent risk of sperm competition perform deeper and more vigorous copulatory thrusts during sex with their partner, according to both men's reports and women's reports. What possible universal comparison scale could they have been using here? So on a scale from threading wet spaghetti through the eye of a donut to pneumatic jackhammer, how hard would you say your boyfriend fucked you last night? But according to Geoffrey, the only reasons these papers get criticised by people on Twitter is because their limbic brains think oral sex is icky and gross. Okay, Geoffrey. David Buss hypothesizes the reasons for gender differences in sexual jealousy based on just so evolutionary theories.
And so the sexes seem to differ in which aspects of the infidelity, with women more attuned to, more upset by the emotional infidelity, men more by the sexual infidelity. Jealousy is an evolved emotion that serves several adaptive functions, okay? One of which you mentioned is a paternity certainty function.
If culture had been constructed around the ideals of women being sex-crazed and men as emotional wallflowers, then perhaps we'd be hypothesizing that women are more worried about the sexual infidelity of men because they'd be more likely to impregnate other women, leading to them having to split their time between multiple baby mamas. And we might be hypothesizing that men would be more upset about the emotional infidelity of women because that would mean that they wouldn't care as much about the children with his genes. Yeah, that's right. I just hypothetically just sewed the fuck out of my woke feminist agenda. Destroyed! So the only question is, why in current culture is this emotional/sexual infidelity phenomenon happening? Perhaps you could entirely blame it on the patriarchy. Women are understood to be faithful and emotional, so perhaps if I were a dude, it would be upsetting. I would assume the emotional investment in the other person was quite strong and quite serious, and men are understood to be hypersexual, unable to resist the urges. I was literally told at school when I was a child that men think about sex every 7 seconds, and I believed it. So maybe within that socio-cultural context, I would be more upset if a man got emotionally invested in someone, because if he just fucked someone else, I'd be telling myself that's just his primal urges. Maybe one of the 8,228.5714285 times he thought about sex during the 16 waking hours of that day, he just gave in to his urges. I mean, who wouldn't? That's like Chinese water torture, but coming from your own balls. A huge mystery to evolutionary psychologists is the elusive female orgasm.
Female orgasm has been a mystery that psychologists have been attempting to understand for decades.
They have done studies with vibrators and so on, indicating that, some of the other great apes do seem to have contractions.
Why is it necessary to have an orgasm? Why would selection have favored having an orgasm sometimes and not others? Why does it happen so infrequently?
In an attempt to give the female orgasm meaning, in this study, Miller and friends hypothesized that women who are unable to orgasm with partners must be less likely to pair bond with their partners, but they just found that to not be true. They also drew up multiple other hypotheses, like seeing if women successfully orgasm more with men of high status, men who earn more, masculine men, liberal men, men high in extroversion, neuroticism, psychoticism, or impulsiveness, and they all failed. Maybe you should have included a variable in here which was men who ask women what she likes in bed and listen to her. Maybe that could have given some clues. Oh yeah, baby, give me that dark triad dick. Why aren't we questioning why the male orgasm evolved? Why should men find sex pleasurable? Why don't they just sneeze out the semen? Men are the ones who are supposedly more desperate to spread seed. After all, they don't need any biological incentives. So, if anything, the women do if they're the ones needing to be convinced to have sex all the time. So, why didn't men simply evolve a completely arousal-free crank mechanism down there for women to derive an orgasm from whenever they please? Where is my crank mechanism, boys? Men need a goddamn factory reset every frickin' time. They need a full night's sleep and 2 hot meals before they can reboot themselves. Not exactly prime conditions for an organism designed to inseminate as far and wide as possible, is it? Why isn't that the goddamn mystery? Bring on the sex robots! Most of evolutionary psychology's main theories come from the disparity in the number of men's and women's gametes, meaning men produce between 70 to 150 million sperm every day, whereas women produce just 1 egg every cycle, or around 300 to 500 over her lifetime. Evolutionary psychologists use this knowledge to come to the conclusion that women are more choosy about who gets to inseminate their gametes, whereas men are just fountains of jizz, I guess, and this causes psychological gender disparities in mating habits. If evolutionary psychologists come across any hard evidence that this assertion is in fact untrue, well, they've evolved to be remarkably resilient. They'll science their way out of anything. Case in point. Here we have a TED Talk from Dr. Bussey. Oh, I'm sorry, a TEDxTalk. It's a 17-minute presentation of everything wrong with the field of evolutionary psychology and why people don't care.
So I'd like you to imagine someone of the opposite sex walking up to you on the street and say, "Hi, I've been noticing you around lately. I find you very attractive." And they ask you one of three questions. Would you go out on a date with me? Would you come back to my apartment with me? Would you have sex with me? Hi, I've been noticing you around. I find you very attractive. Would you have sex with me? So these are actual empirical studies. These are the results of that study. Of the women approached by the male, 56% agreed to go out on the date with the guy, 6% agreed to go back to his apartment, 0% agreed to have sex with him. Of the men approached by the female of the experimenter team, about 50% agreed to go out on a date with her, 69% agreed to go back to her apartment, and 75% agreed to have sex with her.
Unsurprisingly, the outcome is different for men and women, not to mention of cultural shame, risk of violence, risk of pregnancy mentioned as contributing factors. No, simply a male desire for sexual variety and female sexual pickiness. Keep in mind, this study was published 34 years ago, but is based on when the experiments were actually done in 1978 and 1982. So 42 and 46 years ago, when cultural expectations surrounding sexual activity, the study calls it genital union, were even stronger than they are now. This same phenomenon is apparently why women get more upset when men lie about being in love with them for sex, rather than this being the other way around.
So if you want to upset a woman, declare that you love her. I really love you. I have deep feelings for you. Now let's have sex. And you have sex, and then after the sex, after he has an orgasm, he says, "Actually, I was just kidding. I don't love you at all. Goodbye." Well, women in our studies extremely upset by that. On a 7-point scale, ideal number of sex partners, women said on average they would like to have 7/10 of a sex partner over the next month, gradually escalating to a full sex partner at 6 months and leveling off at about 4 to 5 in the lifespan. Men thought 2 in the next month would be about right, 8 in the next couple years, and 18 in the lifespan. This was after eliminating 3 men in our sample who said they would like 1,000.
Of course, now we've got this sexual variety versus sexual pickiness theory proven with 2 experiments from 40 years ago and 2 of his own student surveys. Absolutely bulletproof. But we've got to find more evidence. So Buss hypothesized that men would have more affairs than women. Sexual variety. But then he hit a hurdle. Women are starting to have affairs more and more. Fuck.
Studies point to about 40 to 50% of married men have an affair at some point during the course of their marriage, and it's about 20 to 30% of women. Women are actually catching up with men.
I'll let you into a secret. It's because over the last few decades, we've started letting women leave the house more. More chances just to meet a guy who's just there. More chances to meet a guy and just... But why does Bussey think women are cheating? Time to come up with a new hypothesis, the dual mate hypothesis.
My evolutionary colleagues, other scientists who study this, have advanced what's called the dual mating strategy hypothesis, or the good genes hypothesis, where they basically propose that women can get the best of both worlds by getting investment and resources from one man and good genes, like genes for good health, from another man.
Women are clearly looking to mate with alphas with superior genes and using the beta cook men for stability to raise the kids. You might remember that one from the Manosphere too. It's got various names. One being alpha seed beta needs. Ah, shit, Bussey's hit another hurdle.
There's reason to be skeptical about this. One of the reasons is that we know from DNA fingerprinting technology that only 2 to 3% of offspring are actually fathered by men who are other than the person believed to be the father, the husband.
Shit! So what now? Well, we're going to have to find a way to bring this back to survey data, because that's easier to manipulate. So here we have Buss's final hypothesis. Women actually have affairs because they're cultivating backup mates, just in case their current relationship fails.
Women who have affairs tend to be sexually and emotionally unhappy with their regular relationship. But it turns out it's not true for men. If you compare men who have affairs with men who don't have affairs, there is no difference in their marital happiness. 70% of women who become emotionally involved with their affair partners or fall in love with their affair partners. Now, if you're just trying to get good genes, this seems like a very bad strategy. Why get emotionally involved or fall in love? The qualities desired in a affair partner turn out to be more or less identical to the qualities desired in a long-term mate. And so what I think this does, this set of clues combined with other evidence, points to the mate switching hypothesis, which I think is a more compelling hypothesis about why women have affairs.
What is his evidence? His own survey of 121 students.
In our lab, we've also documented that women tend to cultivate what we call backup mates.
In the study, both genders said, in general, that they look for the same qualities in opposite gender friendships that they look for in romantic partnerships. Something that can easily be put down to cultural expectations of genders, but, you know, it's probably your first thing, Bussy. You know, the backup mate thing, yeah, it's probably that.
One woman told me, she said, men are like soup. You always want to have some on the back burner, okay? In case something goes wrong with your relationship.
Am I missing something here? Am I womaning wrong? Am I supposed to have binders full of backup men? The logistics sounds like a fucking nightmare. I'm not Andrew Huberman. And the way in which Bussy finally bolsters his point home is to throw in some tasty anecdotal evidence.
A female colleague of mine who was complaining to me one day, she said, David, why is it that all the guys that I'm interested in don't seem to show any interest in me? Yet I'm pursued by all these guys who are trying to chat me up, and I have no interest in them. And what I told her is, I said, I was brutally honest, I said, on the mating market, you are an 8, seeking 10s and being lusted after by 6s. And she said that this single piece of information, when she thought about it, was more important to her, was more helpful to her than 3 years of psychotherapy to figure out what the problem was.
So you see, we wouldn't be wasting all of our time and money on the pointless field of psychotherapy if women would just date uglier men. But anyway, evolutionary reasoning accepted, the audience laughs along, and people leave comments praising Dr. Buss for doing real science.
Pragmatic/realistic psychology is my favourite type of psychology. It invalidates most ideological views over the subject in a heartbeat. Someone give this guy a beer! Someone give this man a medal! The poor fella in the brown blazer at 1738 looks like he just had his whole world demolished by that fact. LOL! P.S. David Buss is a smoking hot man. Damn, he be bussin'.
If this does not red pill you, then nothing will.
She's not yours. It's just your turn. Mocktail!
I didn't know Gary Busey was this smart.
And this isn't just his TEDxTalk or podcast appearances. He'll do this in his books rather consistently.
Women's desire for status shows up in everyday life. A colleague overheard a conversation among 4 women at a restaurant. They were all complaining that there were no eligible men around, yet these women were surrounded by male waiters, none of whom was wearing a wedding ring. Waiters, who do not have a high-status occupation, were apparently not even considered by these women. What the women really meant was not that there were no eligible men, but that there were no eligible men of acceptable social status.
Cool story, bro. And he sometimes seems to even confuse himself as to what is an anecdote that he's just pulled out of his ass and what is empirical evidence, even if it is his own heavily biased evidence.
Wives often complain about receiving insufficient support from their husbands. Indeed, lack of sufficient economic provisioning is the most frequently cited divorce complaint of women.
The most common divorce complaint for women is unreasonable behaviour. According to survey data, this is most likely to be men not pulling their weight with the housework. And thank God for the self-sufficient economic provisioning women now have access to. Otherwise, there'd be no way to escape unreasonable behaviour.
That doesn't work either!
In an attempt to replicate the studies from earlier decades, I surveyed 1,491 Americans in the mid-1980s using the same questionnaire. Women and men from Massachusetts, Michigan, Texas, and California rated 18 personal characteristics for their value in a marriage partner. As in the previous decades, women still valued good financial prospects and a mate roughly twice as much as men did.
Newsflash, Dr. Buss, all countries in the world still operate under a patriarchy. There are things called wealth distribution and political power. This could possibly be why there is a trend of women still needing to marry up in order to live a comfortable life and support children. What Bussy Boy fails to mention is that it has been reducing as women earn more. Here's another example of Evo Psych going back on its original hypothesis when new evidence comes to light.
Does nubility indicate more than high reproductive value? Nubile primiparous pregnancy outcomes in evolutionary perspective.
Basically, they're trying to find excuses for old dudes being creepy with teenage women.
They originally hypothesized that men are attracted to low BMI and high WHR, waist to hip ratios, because this was a cue of health and fertility in a woman. But they realized that this is true for women between 16 and 20 more often than women in their early 20s, and women between 16 and 20 have lower fertility and are more prone to infection, so this doesn't make sense.
Shit! Why are men attracted to women between 16 and 20?
Well, now it's because they have high reproductive value, meaning they're less likely to die in childbirth because they have smaller newborns.
We can all collectively breathe a sigh of relief now because we've given ephebophiles an evolutionary get-out-of-jail-free card.
Homosexual people, the gays, you have been dubbed by evolutionary psychologists the Darwinian paradox.
There just has to be an explanation for you, and they've racked their brains trying to explain you, and they've come up with some of the most interesting failed hypotheses in Evo Psych to date. Top 10 failed evolutionary explanations for gay people!
Number 10. A displayed lack of interest in the other sex makes you appear choosy and hard to get, and therefore of high status. Number 9. There aren't enough members of the opposite sex available in the population, so you resort to someone of the same sex. Number 8. The birth control pill is turning women gay. Number 7. Gay people are more intelligent, so we didn't need them for the babies, we needed them for their brains. Number 6. Male homosexual behavior helps negotiate alliances that extend trade networks. Number 5. Female homosexual behavior strengthens economic security within polygynous marriages. Number 4. Gay people are kinder to kin and help with siblings' offspring. Number 3. Men find female homosexual behavior hot, so if he can get 2 gay ladies in bed, he can get them both pregnant at the same time. Cheeky. Number 2. Your genetic makeup as a man can make you extra popular with the ladies, but when these genes are taken too far, you end up gay.
And number 1, take a deep breath for this one.
Your parents subconsciously judge your reproductive value and manipulate you into being gay if they're worried about the ability of your siblings to care about their grandchildren. So if they encourage you to be gay, you'll help out with the other kids and grandkids instead of having your own kids, because they've calculated that the value of you having your own kids is less than the value of you helping out your siblings' kids. Subconsciously.
And sorry guys, unfortunately none of these hypotheses have been backed up by actual data, so you're still
the Darwinian paradox.
Nice argument, Senator. Why don't you back it up with a source?
My source is that I made it the far.
The scientific process allows you to do research within a framework of theory that you choose, but it also allows you to disregard other growing sections of the scientific literature which may be telling a competing story. Dawkins makes the case in The Selfish Gene that all evolutionary selection exists purely for the purposes of the gene. The gene wants to be carried on to the next generation, and everything else happens around this one motivation. So anything that's going on outside of that purpose is some sort of paradox to be explained away, and you write your study according to this assumption. Old women, gay people, or any mental traits that don't make a person attractive to the opposite sex. This tunnel-visioned view of only sexual selection and gendered personality traits based on outdated hunter and gatherer labour divisions permeates their papers, but they can safely do so while only citing their academic mates or cherry-picking papers written by others who assume the same set of supposed evolutionary rules to carry out their research. For instance, here's a paper with David Buss as an author, which was published in 2015. It has a citation from a paper written in 1973. Who's it by? Paul Ekman. My body language video extensively explains his dodgy research practices and notorious debunkings by subsequent lie detection researchers, all of which happened years before 2015. Body language science has moved on from Ekman, but evolutionary psychologists don't seem to want to acknowledge this. They'll consistently cite studies written 50 years ago which are clearly rife with the overt misogynistic and racist attitudes of their time. The amount of times I've looked up a citation of an evolutionary psychology paper and immediately screamed, "Why does this look like it was scanned in? I can see the binder holes. I shouldn't be seeing binder holes. Why does this PDF look like it was downloaded from the Titanic? This should be an artifact in a psychology museum, not a citation." When I clicked on this one, I thought I'd developed a cataract. In the study I mentioned earlier about the optimal fertility of nubile women, there's a paper that's 10 years old cited next to one that's 40 years old, and sandwiched in between them is a reference to a mysterious study about births that occurred between the 18th and 19th century. You know, a cool 200 to 300 years ago. They literally describe a David Buss paper from 1989 as recent. I mean, I guess you could call it recent in the context of the entire history of mankind, but in the terms of psychological science, that paper's basically gone through the menopause. It's useless. Here's a rule you might understand. Don't cite a paper if it's too old for you to consider it sexually attractive. Most evolutionary psychology evidence is based on surveys. Surveys of people living in a world of gender and sexuality bias. Even Gen Z, the woke generation, are still subject to heavy bias of gender norms. Even the ones who would describe themselves as politically active and progressive are consistently coming out with stupid TikTok trends about boy math and girl math, because apparently women do still be shopping and haha, we're really fucking dumb and bad with money.
Anything under $5 is free. Anything I buy with a gift card is free. If I buy something but then I return it, I've made money.
So I bought this purse for $38, which means it was $30. Round down, not up.
People generally act in accordance with cultural stereotypes, but their actions usually don't follow suit as much. If a personality trait is associated with one's identity, they're more likely to say that they act that way, whether they do or not. People also tend to respond to survey questions according to how they'd like to be perceived, rather than a perhaps more culturally shameful reality. This ends up with, for example, men overstating the amount of sexual partners they have had or want, and women understating this. Huge differences can be seen in the results of a survey based on seemingly small and inconsequential differences, such as the survey's stated intention to the participants and how the question is worded. This can mean the difference between 1 in 5 women reporting having experienced SA and 1 in 52, and you know which of these surveys the Manosphere prefers to cite. Sweden was the first country in the world to introduce 180 days of paid parental leave that was non-gender specific. However, it was up to the parents to decide how those days were divided between the couple. Women in Sweden still take more time off, causing them to be held back in their careers more, be paid less, and still do more housework than men, but gradually men in Sweden became one of the leading demographics in the world of fathers taking the most time off to spend time with their children. Cultural beliefs around parental caregiving take longer to shift than a simple change in the law. But it's a start, and it works.
But we hold ourselves back from this progress by making seemingly harmless jokes like the hot crazy matrix, and then researchers will come along and try to prove the supposed evolutionary underpinnings of a stupid meme. So now we apparently have empirical proof that women will put up with uglier men if they're rich, and men will put up with crazier women if they're hot. All this science is doing is absorbing cultural stereotypes, transforming them into graphs and numbers, and spitting them back out at the public in an attempt to further ingrain them. It's no evidence of anything innate. It's fucking stupid. Next, we'll have government-funded research on whether my boyfriend will still love me if I were a worm. Oh my god. Just kidding. I made that one up. A compounding factor in all of this is the tendency for researchers to cook their numbers a little bit. Say I wanted to do some research on how many views a video gets based on the amount of beers drunk within that video, because maybe I wanted to justify my own degenerate actions or something. I don't know, but the research process would be totally unbiased and fair. So I took data from loads of different videos and loads of different creators. Maybe I got AI to watch them all, but there wasn't much of a correlation. So I was kind of bummed. I've got this flipping Excel spreadsheet now, and I've paid that cockend Sam Altman to use his API. I've got to use it for something good now. So let's have a look at some other parameters. Maybe I've cast my net too wide with my data collection. Maybe I should reduce this down to only video essays. Now my pool of data is significantly smaller, and with a smaller pool of data, statistical significance is much more easy to find. In fact, my own videos are probably my largest source of my data, but there is a correlation there. Now, it could be the amount of time I've spent making YouTube videos and the increasing complexity and scope of the topics I choose, and my tendency to tell myself I'm not good enough and that I don't deserve anything could be turning me to drink more and more as time goes on, but nah, it's probably the original thing. Now, we all know that correlation does not equal causation, but whichever way I write my study, I will be implying that it does, because it backs up my original hypothesis. To illustrate how easy it was to hack a study's parameters until the result you wanted would become statistically significant, this paper proved that listening to When I'm 64 by the Beatles reduced your age by a year and a half. All it took was using researcher degrees of freedom in the data analysis. One way to see whether a study really holds up to scrutiny is to get a different researcher to carry it out and see if they get the same result: replication. Unfortunately, it's not an exciting and sexy part of science to just try and copy what somebody else is doing, so it doesn't get done enough. But evidence of psychology studies that were being replicated were consistently showing that they just didn't show the same effect as the original papers stated. The Reproducibility Project was started in 2015 to really try and round up some numbers on how many psychology papers were unable to be replicated. They reran 100 papers, and only 36% of the papers returned significant results, in line with the original study. And of these significant results, they were far less significant than the original study. Another replication project was started in 2018, in which 62% of the papers were able to reproduce, but again, the effect sizes were only half of the original papers. And then another study about unreplicable studies found that the less replicable a study is, the more likely it is to be cited by other papers as supporting evidence. There have been pretty prominent cases quite recently of behavioral scientists just literally changing data in their Excel spreadsheets in order to make their effect sizes seem way more significant. The recent exposés of Francesca Gino and Dan Ariely's behavioral science fraud, alleged fraud, have brought these to light. And these are professors at Harvard and Duke. This is happening at the top of the field, and the scientists who do this, for as long as they get away with it, will use these significant findings to do TED Talks, TEDxTalks, write books, do corporate consultation. Selling scientific evidence on the supposed intrinsic nature of human psychology is incredibly lucrative. But in some cases, it's not just for the career advancement of the researcher. Scientific fraud can be used to advance political agendas, such as these studies on the supposed innate nature of human prejudice and its evolutionary underpinnings, and another in which skin colour was supposedly linked to aggression, which was then readily used by white supremacists.
The former was retracted by the journal for huge flaws in the data, and the latter was retracted by the journal because it decided to cherry-pick citations from studies conducted by denounced academics, including self-professed scientific racist Richard Lynn, and then presented that information as if it were representative of the state of the literature at the time.
It was a bit like writing a paper on the link between vaccines and autism and only citing Andrew Wakefield. And on top of that, paper mills are a huge issue in scientific literature. They work by making up plausible papers and then submitting them to journals and seeing who will accept them. Once one is accepted, they'll just auction off author credits to the academic willing to bid the highest for it.
Academics accumulate prestige by publishing as many papers as possible and racking up as many citations of those papers as possible. Sometimes publication is required for an academic to continue in their career. Success is not measured by accuracy of research. It's all about quantity over quality. It's estimated that even in the most prestigious journals, 2% of the papers in them are from paper mills. In others, without the same rigorous checking protocols, it's up to 40%.
Much of the time, however, researchers are entering projects with completely pure intentions, but it's very easy to just end up subconsciously tampering with parameters when you see a correlation emerging, or when you don't see a correlation emerge and you end up thinking that you've done something wrong, so you rerun your data until you find a correlation, and then you think that you've done something right, when in reality all you've done is found a very specific way to present your data, but one that doesn't actually represent what you conclude.
In 2011, an analysis of over 250 psychology papers found that more than 1 in 10 of the p-values was incorrect, and that when the errors were big enough to change the statistical significance of the result, more than 90% of the mistakes were in favor of the researchers' expectations, making a non-significant finding significant.
Various suggestions have been made to remedy this crisis, such as blind data analysis, adversarial collaboration, and pre-registration.
But the late-stage capitalist nature of academic journals stifles any real incentive to publish studies that are reflective of the reality of the messy nature of human psychology. There are even calls to make the threshold of significance much more rigorous, so that instead of requiring your p-value to be less than 0.05, which means that there's less than 5% chance that your results could have happened in a world where the null hypothesis is true, it should actually be less than 0.005, which would be a 0.5% chance that the null hypothesis is true. This would mean that sample sizes in psychology studies would need to be increased on average by about 70%. And it's not only survey-based behavioural studies that are under fire, it's results from psychological experiments using fMRI machines too, which you would expect to be pretty uncontestable, but one researcher put a dead salmon in an fMRI machine just to prove that the readings are heavily subject to the bias of the researcher collecting the data because of the different algorithms you can use to decipher which neurons are firing and when. The researchers found that there was a way to show that this fish was emotionally reacting to pictures of people in socially inclusive or exclusive situations. Nobody tell BetterHelp they'll start hiring dead fish as therapists. Also, I'm pitching this as the new They Did Surgery on a Grape.
In a 2013 PNAS paper, Johnson used more advanced statistical techniques to test the assumption researchers commonly make, that a p of 0.05 means there's a 5% chance the null hypothesis is true. His analysis revealed that it didn't. In fact, there's a 25% to 30% chance the null hypothesis is true when the p-value is 0.05, Johnson said.
So if we take this new information and go back to this mental 3D rotation task we were looking at earlier,
this p-value was reported as less than 0.05, meaning finding that there was less than 5% chance that there was no male advantage in mental 3D rotation.
Which, taken at face value, would seem pretty significant. But new statistical analysis reveals that there was actually at least a 25% chance that the null hypothesis could be true. And on top of that, when you consider that they only used 38 men and 39 women in the study, the supposed statistical significance has been thrown into a meat grinder and spit out again, and now it's a load of numbers in the floor mixed with blood and guts. And this isn't only a recent phenomenon. Due to the complex nature of DNA, it's basically impossible to track who is carrying which gene and which of these genes are being expressed and how and why. So the closest we can get to tangible evidence of heritability of any trait is in the case of twins. The trouble of using monozygotic or identical twins, though, is that they're quite rare to come across in the first place, and what's even rarer in the case of identical twins is finding a pair which have been separated at birth and nurtured in entirely different environments to assess psychological similarities exist. For these reasons, twin studies were pretty much doomed from the start, but that wasn't going to stop Cyril Burt, who crashed onto the scene in the early 1900s with a seemingly superhuman ability to find monozygotic twins separated at birth and reared in entirely different environments, finding twice as many case studies as any previous attempts. The results of his study supposedly concluded that IQ was 80% heritable, a statistic which is still widely repeated to this day.
And intelligence, according to the best behavior genetics estimates, is 80% heritable in adults. So all of these seem to be heritable. They're all influenced genetically, and that means they could all evolve under mate choice.
Burt was knighted and became a leading member of the British Eugenics Society. After the horrors of the Second World War, people became more distrustful of the science behind heritable IQ, and Burt's once highly respected position in the field was viewed through a more critical lens. Burt was found to be simply guessing the intelligence of the twins' parents and reporting it as measured IQ, and he was found to be using fake names as collaborators, and they found correlated IQ scores between twins to be similar to the same 3 decimal points to other pairs of twins from his other studies, a situation nigh on impossible. More revelations about his fraud were uncovered in subsequent years. And since Cyril Burt, there's only been 6 subsequent studies published involving twins, all have which been found to be seriously flawed. The supposed separated twins were often separated between 2 and 6 years old, were adopted by members of the same family, were reared in extremely similar environments, and sometimes were reunited for years at a time or had intermittent visitations. A quote from one of these studies reads, "The twins were reunited most of the time from 5 to 15. Like, you'd probably learn more doing an IQ study on Jedward, for fuck's sake. Somebody needs to figure out what's going on there. Did they inherit this from their parents? Or do they perpetually inherit this from each other in a sort of horrific vortical genetic feedback loop? Science has to tell us."
Hey baby, I'd ovulate for you. I push that egg right down my fallopian tube. I hacked your pee, now your D has got me restless. I think I'm going into estrus.
I have never witnessed an obsession like the one between evolutionary psychologists and the sneaky, concealed menstrual cycles of women. They look at the animal kingdom, females face down, ass up, ready to take in the prime genetic material of the most viable mate and shake their fists at the sky with rage at the realization that human females will not reward them with the same display.
To see whether estrus was really lost during human evolution, as researchers often claim.
Geoffrey Miller obtained a sample size of, wait for it, 18 sex workers who anonymously recorded their position on the ovulatory cycle for him, along with that night's earnings for a total of 60 days. Just gonna do the girl maths for you, that's a total of 2 periods per woman. Ovulating women, it was revealed, earned $35 more than menstruating women and $20 more than women elsewhere in their cycles. Women on the pill had no estrus earning peak. It was such a breakthrough that it got published in the New York Times. The study also states participants only logged onto the website on about half of the days when they worked, or 27% of the 60 requested days. So the sex workers could barely even be bothered with this bullshit.
Our results give clear economic evidence that human estrus actually does exist. The findings that estrus impacts earnings could have implications for women selling cars or giving big presentations as CEOs, Miller says. Should women schedule big job interviews during certain weeks of the month? We don't know. But maybe.
So we've ended this article with the implication that women are only useful as car salespeople or CEOs during ovulation. And during those times, you're probably only useful if men find you sexually attractive. And if you're on the pill or post-menopause, just give up?
Indeed. The standard argument for women's extended sexuality, sexual receptivity outside the fertile estrus phase, is that it evolved to help women extract material resources from males.
So the only reason men aren't repulsed by women when they're not fertile is because women are manipulatively seducing them for resource extraction. But that's not where ovulation science ends. Oh no! Remember the TEDxTalk in which David Bussyboy mentions the dual mate hypothesis? Come on, haven't you been taking notes? So, women look for alpha chads to sleep with while fertile, and beta bucks to settle down with and sponge resources off once they're inseminated by chad genes. So that must be why they conceal their ovulation. Because we're sneaky like that. But it got debunked by DNA data disproving it because there isn't a load of cuckolding dads everywhere. Well, this theory, based on a now disproven hypothesis, inspired an entire subsection of evolutionary psychology. And you'll be amazed at the amount of studies they managed to squeeze out of this one. So supposedly facial symmetry is evolutionarily attractive because it means that the person is parasite free. So if you see someone with a lopsided face, your subconscious cave brain is going, he's got a tapeworm. I mean, if anything, I like a man with a pet. It shows responsibility. I mean, if it popped out and started watching you while you were doing her from behind, I mean, it would be kind of off-putting. So ovulation science, based on the debunked dual mate hypothesis, would dictate that when we are fertile, we should find symmetrical men extremely sexy. And guess what? They found that we prefer the smell of symmetrical men when ovulating.
More symmetric men smell better to women, specifically to women who are at the fertile phase of the menstrual cycle.
And we even become more symmetrical ourselves.
Symmetry appears so important that the female body even performs its own tricks to appear more symmetrical. In a simple experiment at the University of Liverpool, England, biologists measure the hands and ears of women before, during, and after ovulation. They discover that 24 hours before ovulation, the women's hands and ears alter shape to become more symmetrical.
Come get your tapeworm-free sex, boys! Supposedly, during ovulation, we women dress sexier. Men like us when we wear red, but not menopausal women. We're more likely to wear red, we're more assertive, we prefer variety in men, and therefore products. If our current partner is asymmetrical, we fantasize about other symmetrical tapeworm-free men. We try and lose weight. We prefer the faces of more masculine men. We prefer the bodies of masculine men. We prefer the voices of masculine men. We prefer masculine behavioral displays. We prefer tall men. We emit pheromones. We can tell who's gay. We're more likely to vote for Barack Obama. And they got a little carried away with themselves and they thought that they could find evidence for women walking sexier when ovulating. But they found a negative correlation. So apparently we walk less sexy when we're ovulating. That wasn't going to stop them from publishing though. The researchers concluded that the women must have been walking less sexy because they're trying to ward off undesirable men.
I don't know how that's supposed to track with the other studies that supposedly make us more attractive to men, but so if the hypothesis is derived by working back from the data that they've collected which had proved the opposite of the original hypothesis, then what's that categorized as? A top-down hypothesis? A bottom-up hypothesis? A fucking face-down, ass-up, give me a reach-around hypothesis? Well, ovulation science did not escape the replication crisis. In fact, we don't dress sexier. We don't like bad boys more. We don't like low voices more. We don't like masculine bodies more. In fact, these meta-analyses of ovulation science found that there was no overall effect in women's mate preferences across the ovulation cycle, and one mentioned that the previous correlations were probably found due to research artifacts, publication bias, and the use of imprecise definitions of the fertile phase. So, researcher degrees of freedom. The study about women's preference for lower voices, for instance, used the first day of a woman's period to decipher where she was in her cycle, which can yield results very different to when you're actively measuring someone's hormonal levels. In fact, it was found that the more precise the researchers were in recording ovulatory cycles, the less likely they were to yield a result supporting their hypothesis. A replication of the male and female response to people wearing red also found no effect, and it turns out the original study that women wear red when fertile had some very creatively cooked numbers in it thanks to the very small sample size. I will say there is one way to tell where a woman is on her menstrual cycle from what she wears. So if she's wearing white, specifically on the bottom half, it means it's probably not day 1 to 5. This larger study found no preference for masculine features during ovulation, and this study made use of a very large sample size of 1,043 women using 26,000 of their diary entries. They found an increase in general sexual desire during ovulation, but absolutely no change in the type of man women were attracted to. It seems the larger a study is, the less likely you are to find a statistically significant result, because it's a lot harder to find a way to manipulate data when you have a large sample size. Yet the public are constantly led to believe that studies with very small sample sizes are a completely normal part of science and give trusted empirical findings. Two of the most prominent original researchers in this area of ovulation science are Randy Thornhill and Stephen Gangestad. They even wrote an entire book together in 2008 based on the research around women's dual sexuality. Stephen Gangestad has since taken a different path. In a recent interview with Slate magazine, he admitted,
"When we wrote the book, we were drawing on a broad literature, but some of what we wrote was just garbage because we trusted all that work, including our own. In terms of overall effects, I don't think there is anything."
However, his collaborator, Randy Thornhill, seems to continue to stand by his original literature and is happy to repeat it on various podcasts.
I know that there's been a lot of discussion about the hypothetical evolutionary purpose of female orgasm.
There's no evidence that females that orgasm very infrequently have fewer babies. So I don't think it's fundamentally that. So when a female has an orgasm, she has uterine contraction, of course. It works like a suction, and she's pulling the male's ejaculate up to the cervix to conceive. Imagine a female who has two mating partners. She orgasms with one, pulling his ejaculate up to the cervix. So she, in effect, is mated with both, but she's doing something more subtle, and that's a component of cryptic female choice.
Oh yeah, podcasts.
Don't you dare debate me on anthropology. I've been listening to podcasts.
There's a new lucrative sales funnel in town. If you want to sell a book, supplements, or a political ideology, there's no better way of doing it than hiding it in the format of a self-help podcast, reeling in clicks from innocent people just trying to improve their lives. These podcasts are, in my opinion, no better than clicking on a spam ad on a porn site that says you must find out this one weird trick to lose belly fat and doctors hate her. The point is to invite an academic or expert of some kind on and not engage with them critically in any way. Just let them speak. Let them plug their bullshit book or their bullshit supplements. Smile and nod. Pretend you're taking notes. even if they're completely contradicting what another guest told you on your same podcast.
Caffeine, it is the original cognitive enhancer. We see consistently people perform better.
You see a reduction in all-cause mortality that correlates to coffee consumption. Is it good for cognitive decline? Yes.
I am actually an advocate of drinking coffee.
It allows us to function better. It allows us to work harder, longer.
People who regularly drink coffee seem to be protected against cardiovascular disease and even neurologic conditions like Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, and MS.
All the studies are now showing consistently you will have less heart disease and you'll live longer if you drink coffee.
Do you think there's correlation or a link between caffeine consumption and a shrinking brain?
Yeah.
You get views from a clickbait title, they get to sell a book or supplements that haven't gone through proper clinical trials. Everybody wins. Well, apart from your listeners. If you want to be the grifter, take a load of well-established, mind-numbing, obvious health and lifestyle tips. Sleep well, eat healthily, etc., etc. Boring! But then, add one secret tip that the doctors won't tell you. In fact, perhaps doctors hate you for this one weird tip. Maybe they're lying to you. Be aware that a lot of people won't stick around for the whole podcast, so maybe start with your one weird trick, but then fill the rest of the runtime with just normal life and health advice that any fucking chump on the street could give you, so that your one weird trip sounds pretty fucking plausible, actually. I mean, the rest of this is plausible, so like, why wouldn't their one weird tip be plausible as well? Like your fucking sugar spike tablets. Hey, perhaps there's more of these weird tips on this person's own podcast or in their book, or maybe the weird tip is their supplements. I know so much about grifting at this point. I could enact so many fucking 4D chess moves on you guys. You'd be signed up to a crypto rug pull, holding worthless moon NFTs and living off moon pills, and speed reading my 69 Rules for Life moon Bible while you sleep each night before you could say, why the fuck am I signed up to 89 monthly subscriptions? Do you know how many Lamborghinis I could have right now? Yeah, that's how I flex. I anti-flex. I tell you how much I don't have, because I like you guys too much.
Join my Patreon. In fact, studies have shown that early hominids who signed up to the Mooncat Patreon were the most successful in procuring resources to attract mates and ensure the passing of their genes to the next generation. So sign up today to be a part of the Mooncat progeny and get tier-specific perks like extra behind-the-scenes content, insights into my research process, STEM downloads for you musical sorts wanting to remix my tracks, your name shouted out in the video credits, early access to new videos, and 4 songs about my clitoris that I'm working on for a future project. But most of all, get a warm, fuzzy feeling inside for supporting me! Link in the description.
The relaxed conversational tone of podcasts gives academics a lot of leeway to be very loosey-goosey with the scientific literature they're communicating. And what makes them even more frustrating to watch is the evolutionary psychology just so stories being used as a chaser. We can start with a podcast from Diary of a CEO, hosted by Stephen Bartlett. He's the young whippersnapper on the UK's Dragon's Den, the tech guy, the social media mogul, the guy the camera cuts to whenever someone utters the word TikTok. He spent some time wanting to be the British Gary Vee.
At no point in my adult life have I had to find X on a triangle. Real life isn't about finding X on a triangle.
But when he found out that he wasn't batshit insane enough to tell people to imagine their family members being shot directly in the face, he hop, skip, jumped onto the podcast train. Chew fucking chew. So this episode with #1 neuroscientist Dr. Tara Swart, I'll give it to her, has got to be some of the most entertaining bullshit I've ever listened to.
When a baby is born, one of the ways that it learns what emotion the mum's experiencing, how it understands its own emotions, starts off mostly with eye contact with the mum. So most people are right-handed, so they'll be holding their baby in their left arm so they can still use their dominant hand to do stuff. And that means that when you gaze at your baby, your right eye is looking into their left eye, and then that interaction that from the optic nerve is going around the brain. It's impacting the amygdala where emotions come from, and it's creating this emotional resonance loop that's part of how the mother and the baby bond. So that right eye to left eye contact is the most bonding eye contact that you can have with someone.
She doesn't even cite any research to back this up. I looked and I didn't find a study on this. She's literally just making this up. Like, I would say, sounds plausible, doesn't it? But like, no! This doesn't even sound plausible!
So one group lifted finger or elbow weights. I think this was a 2-week study, and they showed, I think it was about a 40% increase in muscle mass of the targeted muscle group for those weights. Their counterparts only imagined lifting weights for 2 weeks, and they had a 13% increase in muscle mass. It's in the book.
It's in the book, guys. This study, which she deemed valuable enough to put in her book, reported 8 people increased their arm strength 13% in relation to a control group. 8 people! And I think this is probably the best evolutionary psychology just so story I have ever heard.
Women who interact with each other physically closely, they synchronize their menstrual cycles. So whenever I want to explain something that's complex, or I don't actually know the current neuroscience, I always take it back to what happened in ancient times. So when we were living in the cave, the men hunted and gathered and lived quite nomadically. So sometimes they would go away for months at a time. If they went far enough away and were closer to another cave of the same tribe, they would actually just stay there and never return to the original cave. But mostly they would leave for weeks or months and then return to the original cave. So if he was going to be away for months and he couldn't, there weren't men there to defend the women from predators, maybe there was going to be a spell of the Ice Age and they would all freeze to death or they wouldn't have food, he needed to make sure that at least 5 women were impregnated with his sperm at the same time. At least 1 out of 5 would survive. So to be able to do that, they had to be fertile at the same time. So that's why that mechanism exists.
Okay, so women don't even sync their periods! That doesn't even happen! This has 11 million views. This woman is a senior lecturer at King's College London. What is happening? What are we doing? Why is she saying all this?
I'm the Chief Science Officer at Heights. We've created the world's first smarter supplement in a really clever double capsule to deliver all your brain's key nutrient needs.
Oh right, yes, the podcast circle has successfully revived ovulation science. Even Diana Fleischman has dipped her little toes in.
We found that ovulating women showed increased aversion to men who were Black or Latino or mixed race compared to other white men. And those are the kinds of interactions, that have a deep evolutionary impact. Throughout most of our evolutionary history, I would have not encountered anybody who looked different than me unless it was probably a very aggressive interaction. Although there was some trade and things like that, I don't think women generally were involved in that.
Oh, that's nice. So now women are more racist when they're fertile. That must have been really conflicting for the ovulating women in the ballot box preparing to vote for Barack Obama. We just cannot catch a break, can we? Let's look into this one, shall we? Okay, so it's a study that she carried out in 2009 on a total of 77 college students. And oh no, they did a replication in 2015 with 2,226 people, which found no effect. Oof! You're referencing a paper you did in 2009. It's your job to know about this stuff, Diana. Are you sure you didn't know about that? Dr. Sarah Hill likes to hop around on these podcasts, but her main thing is, I'm totally a feminist and all, but perhaps women on hormonal birth control are in a constant dissociative fugue state that's causing the mating crisis, and therefore, downfall of the West?
When women are ovulating, they tend to show more skin, and research even finds that they're more likely to wear the color red.
Vocal, facial, and behavioral masculinity are things that women are really zeroing in on right near high fertility in the cycle. They smell sexier, they move sexier, their voices are sexier.
Strippers get more tips.
Strippers get more tips. There's been a lot of research indicating that they tend to exhibit a heightened preference for cues to, in particular, masculinity. That's the one that seems to be the most replicable. I think that what the birth control pill essentially does by flattening our, the cyclically changing hormones and sort of minimizing the role of estrogen in terms of our partner choice and partner preferences and the types of qualities that we're attuned to when we're choosing mates. I think that it sort of downplays the importance of sexiness in a women's partner choice. You tend to go after the tangibles, right? Like, okay, is this person going to be a good provider? Is this person, stable? And there's some evidence that's consistent with this. And there's been some research even showing that if women chose their partners when they're on hormonal birth control and then discontinue it, that this can lead to changes in how they perceive and how attracted they are to their partner.
The women who are in their most fertile periods prefer the wider-jawed men.
Yes.
That's probably a problem because we have a lot of tension between women and men in our society, and we have no idea how much that's driven by the fact that the pill is transforming the manner in which females perceive the most masculine men. I mean, it's terrifying if that's the case.
For this claim, I can only assume she's referencing this study based on 200 women, which has since been debunked by a study of 6,482 women showing no change in preference of masculinity when using the pill. And also, you can see the online test they used for this study, and the choices included a monkey. Never underestimate a woman in her ape era.
Research has been showing now for about 20 years that when women are in the point in the cycle when estrogen is high, that's associated with an increased preference for testosterone cues.
Sarah, I'm really struggling to give you the benefit of the doubt here. You've made it your life's mission to scare women out of using hormonal contraception, so surely you must know about these huge failed replications. You have to be intentionally ignoring them. But she doesn't stop at the implication that it's making women attracted to betas, though. No, she goes further, based on no evidence at all that it's turning women gay.
I've heard from a lot of bisexual women who get nudged one way or the other, depending on where they are in the cycle. I've heard from women who thought that they were bisexual and then went on or off the birth control pill and then had that change where they were either completely straight or thought that they were completely lesbian.
She's pretty vague about this one because she actually has zero evidence to back it up, just that she's heard a lot of stories.
Did you manage to find a significant swing in one way or the other?
It's really interesting because for most, the thing I've heard the most, but I've heard it all. But the thing I've heard most frequently is that they become a little more straight when they're off the pill.
Warning, warning, anecdotal evidence is approaching.
A story of a girl friend of mine who is a mostly lesbian bisexual. But then she said, one other thing that I noticed when I came off the pill was that for 1 week out of every month, I was straight again.
And I guess I can guess which week of the month it was.
Have you ever come across that before?
Yeah, that's right, guys. Chris's bi mate went straight during the 1 week of the month she took a break from taking her pill. But do you think the Daily Mail cares about scientific consensus? But apparently all of these gay zombie women are affecting men's testosterone too.
We have so many women on hormonal birth control, so much ovulation being suppressed, meaning that there are so few cues to estrogen, like sort of in the air, that could it be that men's lack of achievement motivation is in part driven by the fact that their testosterone is in the toilet because of the lack of sort of ovulating women to inspire those higher levels of T.
For whom the birth control pill makes masculine men particularly undesirable.
Right.
Now imagine that transforms itself into political motivation, because it might. We don't know anything about the relationship between hormonal transformation and political activism, but the probability that there's no relationship is zero.
So now we're gay bisexual zombies, and due to our complete lack of agency, we're horny for betas, and we're gonna vote for the Democratic Party.
Ha ha ha! Take your lip pills, ladies!
But no, we're not gonna stop there. We're pissing out our synthetic hormones and the boys are gonna drink them! Then they'll vote for Biden too!
Think about the fact that women who are on birth control that then urinate into the toilet, which then gets into the water supply, which then increases the amount of estrogen that's supposed to be consumed by men.
They're gonna get our cuties!
We know there's a lot of xenoestrogens in the in the water, and that might be messing with their hormones. And men are heavier than they used to be, and fat aromatizes testosterone and turns it into estrogen, which also lowers men's testosterone levels.
That's right. The xenoestrogen cuties in your drinking water will make you grow bitch tits.
They've done studies where they videotape women when they're walking at high and low fertility, and then they just show their silhouettes to outside evaluators, and they walk sexier.
No, Sarah, we walk less sexier. She didn't even get the face down, ass up hypothesis right.
See, they've done studies where men watch women's silhouettes walking, and the women who are currently during their 7-day you can get me pregnant period, they're the ones that they're most attracted to. The fucking silhouette of the way they walk displays their
high
current...
heels replicate that.
Guys, we're witnessing the spread of bullshit science in real time.
They then either come off or don't come off birth control, but find that they come out of this fucking hormonal fugue state.
Guys, I'm entering a fugue state. Where's my cute little twink boy? Right, so based on a load of debunked ovulation science and unreplicated studies of women's sexual preferences when on contraception, birth control is now the sole reason for why women won't dress sexy for you anymore. It's making them only want to date beta providers. It's why men aren't men anymore, but they are Timothee Chalamet. It's why women are gay, depressed and neurotic. It's why men are fat and unmotivated to get jobs and don't want to sleep with women because they can't smell when they're fertile anymore, and it's turning the frickin' frogs gay, and it's why Tucker Carlson doesn't want to fuck the green M&M anymore.
The green M&M, you will notice, is no longer wearing sexy boots.
You went on the pill, didn't you, you slut?
Call me by your name, Timothee!
I'm assuming you don't know the backstory of Chris Williamson, and if you do, why? He started out as a club promoter who then went on to star in the first series of Love Island. And according to this BBC interview, he didn't enjoy his stint on the show because the producers wouldn't let him discuss the evolutionary underpinnings of male aggression for hours on end with the other contestants. So now Chris hosts his own podcast in which he invites on whatever academic he can get his clammy little hands on to report on the latest updates from the world of misogyny science. It's by far the worst one for peddling misinformation via some of the worst small-scale gender personality studies I've ever seen, backed up with evolutionary just-so chases and a healthy sprinkling of anecdotes. Here are some examples.
Among over 11,600 US employees, women were less satisfied with their jobs when they reported to a female boss, whereas men showed no difference in job satisfaction based on their supervisor's gender. Why do you think that is?
Our male ancestors were more often involved in coalitionary contexts, so they were forming larger groups, both for the context of hunting, but also, I think, more consequentially for the context of warfare.
Because you see, when the men went out hunting, they needed to do it in groups where there was a clear hierarchy, otherwise it wouldn't work.
In these contexts, what helps is a strong hierarchy.
And the women, you see, back in the cave, they needed to all be friends and they needed to stay on the same status so then they could look after all the kids together.
They preferred contexts where they were of equal power and equal resources.
And that's why they gossip about each other.
Data suggests that gossip is useful because it lowers people's social appeal.
Oh, did I mention that girls have no idea how to do sports because they're too dumb to realise that you can play in opposition to someone and then not be in opposition to them when not playing the game?
You're not that good as a guy. You take yourself off and sit on the bench so that you guys can win the championship. Whereas I think, and it's been said by many of my colleagues, in some ways, women and girls would rather lose the game and have everybody play than win. If you're a girl or a woman, when somebody's done you wrong on the field, you can't let it go. They're personally offended by a slide tackle gone wrong, whereas men just shake hands and get on with it.
What's better than this? Guys being dudes.
We also slut-shame each other, not because of internalised misogyny, no, but because we're trying to level out the price of sex.
Do women have an intolerance of sexy peers?
Absolutely. It's a robust finding. I did a study on this.
Unless you have this kind of game theory perspective, it's really hard to understand why slut shaming is mostly done by women to other women.
Correct. If you think about sex as having a price, and if one woman is prepared to lower the price from 3 dates to 1 date, or from X amount of resources to 0.5 X amount of resources, that lowers the market value of whatever that thing is overall.
We're applying laissez-faire economic theory to female intrasexual slut-shaming. I've never needed to touch grass more in my goddamn life. Wait, does that mean I can sell stocks in my sexiness? Guys, I'm projected to get sexier very soon. I'm literally about to ovulate. Bye now, before it's too late.
Women who are high in intrasexual competitiveness are more likely to advise women who they perceive as potential mating threats to cut off more hair in an attempt to sabotage their attractiveness.
This is probably one of the most stupid studies I've come across throughout this entire thing. The effect is literally about 2 millimeters of extra hair being cut off.
Yes. That study finds itself in the book.
Okay, so underlying it all, I would say, is this sense that we are all equals. So if my friend does much better than me on an exam and I find out about it, I feel bad. It's like, who is she? And I've done quite a bit of research on that. Quite a bit of research.
Okay, to sum this up, academics enter social sciences and psychology fields with a pre-existing bias, whether they admit it or not. The last few decades have provided them with the institutions and funding with which they can carry out research, but most of the time, the funding only allows them to carry out studies with, at most, a few hundred people, and most of the time it appears to be less than 100 Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic samples of university students. This could be fine for preliminary studies which call for further investigations, but they are consistently communicated to the public as if they're not, despite behavioral science being one large dumpster fire. Some of its academics are procuring careers for themselves by inviting themselves or accepting invites onto podcasts where they can cite their own research and or the research of others who agree with them, which is ethically questionable in itself if they're profiting from it in any way. If you just don't mention the more precise, wider scope studies that have since debunked you, then audiences of millions will assume that this is some sort of truth. I've not given up on science. I believe that improvements can and will be made to the process, but it will take time. We need pre-registration so people carrying out studies will get published no matter the outcome, and the method of analysing the data is decided at the start, not once the results are known. Statistical significance in psychology studies needs to be way more rigorous, and adversarial collaboration and replication needs to be a bog standard part of the process, along with peer review before publication. Science makes its way forward in increments and learns from its mistakes, and scientific consensus, I believe, is ambling slowly towards pastures of truth and enlightenment, every now and again having to scrape the dog shit of scientific misogyny and racism off its foot. But in the midst of this process, academics from what they call the intellectual dark web emerge from the academic swamp, appearing on podcasts wielding a singular paper teeming with the aforementioned scientific failings, and if it's just controversial enough, you can fool people into thinking it's going against the mainstream scientific grain, so therefore it must be the truth. Just make it look like everyone else is too pussy to admit it, and you can wrap it up in a tidy little bow by providing an evolutionary just so story and sprinkle a little anecdote on top and send it to Podcast Town or journalists. And then perhaps a coder at Google will read it and write a memo based on his meticulous research about why perhaps he has fewer female colleagues because men are more competitive and like things more than people, and women like people more than things, and when he gets fired by Google, he becomes a hero pariah for the intellectual dark web.
You're not diverting from the central tenets of evolutionary
psychology and biology. You're not conjuring this out of thin air. There's a nice solid scientific literature behind you.
When I first heard about it, I thought, well, this mean, angry man must have written some things saying that women suck at tech or they suck at this, and people were reacting to this blatant misogynistic bribe that I was hearing about. When I read it, I was so confused because I was like, where's the mean stuff?
Then Geoffrey Miller himself comes and defends him.
Rated fairly, his memo would get at least an A- at any master's level psychology course.
Well, I'd fucking love to be one of your students, Geoffrey, because Damore wrote this over the course of one flight. His citations for sex differences included the Wikipedia page for sex differences in psychology, the Wikipedia page for empathizing and systemizing theory, and 2 other studies in which the sex differences could easily be attributable to cultural differences, and a handful of opinion pieces that backed him up. Damore references another theory prevalent in psychology, one which he probably picked up from Jordan Peterson, the theory that there's more cognitive variance among men than women. This has been a very contentious area of evolutionary psychology, with some people under the belief that the mental traits for IQ are carried on the X chromosome, which gives them more variance. Supposedly, men therefore show more outlier geniuses, but are also more likely to have some sort of learning disability. But a recent 2021 meta-analysis of 3 decades of cognitive sex difference science has shown this to not be true. But this doesn't stop them from implying that women don't belong in STEM. Perhaps they're not less capable, perhaps they just don't want to be in STEM.
So there was a great paper released, the Atlantic Monthly just wrote an article on it this week, showing that as societies become more egalitarian, the gap between enrollment, the enrollment gap between men and women in STEM fields increases.
Yeah.
And what do the feminists say about that? Pseudoscience.
The authors of Jordan's favourite STEM gender paradox study, Stowett and Geary, found a correlation showing that countries with more gender equality actually showed a regression of women graduating in STEM, implying that their innate propensity to care for babies instead of things was making them choose different careers. But when others tried to replicate the study, they just couldn't get the same correlation. Stowett and Geary didn't disclose the indexes or equations they'd used to come to their correlation, so the people attempting to replicate the correlation had to try and laboriously figure this out for themselves. Turns out, Geary and Stowett had used an index for a country's gender equality, which was not intended to be used for this purpose, called the GGGI. In addition to this, in order to calculate the country's ratio of STEM graduates, they took the percentage of women who graduated in STEM out of all women who graduated and added that to the percentage of men who graduated in STEM out of all men who graduated, then divided that by the percentage of women who graduated in STEM, which is such a weird way to do it that the people investigating the study and trying to replicate it couldn't work out what the hell they'd done, so they emailed Geary and Stowett themselves, who allegedly ghosted the investigators after one email. So this led to them contacting the journal, who in turn had to contact Geary and Stowett, after which they finally got a response. So when the investigators reran the data with an index that was intended to be used for these types of analyses, including those metrics, and used a normal mathematical equation for figuring out the amount of women with STEM degrees, they just found no correlation. So we've got the researcher degrees of freedom striking again. The journal that published Stowett and Geary's paper ended up having to release a corrigendum for it. So now, defeated, he's resorted to complaining about it on Chris Williams' podcast, of course. Neglecting to go into details about the actual issues with his original study, he instead alludes to a generalised "the wokes are at it again with their emotions" response.
The response to it was pretty negative. We got a lot of emails. The editors of the journal apparently got a lot of emails, including, attacks on us and pressure for them to retract the article.
It is true that most of the time studies don't get as much scrutiny as Geary's did, but the study was also getting a hell of a lot of press, mostly at the hands of Jordan Peterson. So yes, of course people were going to start looking into your data, Geary, and what they found was not good.
There was a commentary on it that did get published. I think just because the editor got tired of getting so many commentaries, they finally say, well, we're already published one and we're not going to do any other. they complained about how we define proportion of males and females in STEM fields, which was just just kind of a stupid thing.
Kind of a stupid thing? Okay, so if we take an example, Algeria, the most extreme point on your correlation graph here, 53% of STEM graduates are women and 47% are men, yet using Geary's convoluted maths, only 9% of all women who got degrees were graduates of STEM degrees, and 13% of all men who graduated in STEM. So Algeria, using a normal metric, would show a slight female bias in STEM graduations, not a male bias like Geary's paper states. I mean, it's kind of not a stupid thing if the metric you're using could completely flip whether a country has more men or more women graduating in STEM. That's basically what your whole study is based on. In fact, if you look back on Geary's career, you'll find that he used to carry out studies which supposedly proved men were more talented than women at STEM subjects in school, discussing potentially evolutionary underpinnings. When women started outperforming men at these subjects in school, Geary quietly moved on to why women can't do STEM to why they won't. It's not only women that suffer from bad gender science, it also further entrenches attitudes that leave men feeling as if they're not wired to be good fathers, or that they're innately aggressive, and if not, there must be something wrong with them, making them wish to change themselves, following people like Andrew Tate, or signing up for alpha male courses where they pay $18,000 to get their backpack thrown in a tub.
Here's why. Are you touching me?
And these beliefs can also lead to women overestimating the dangers of being around men, which in turn can affect men negatively. For every woman that's scared of being attacked when out alone, there's a man desperately trying to reassure a woman in a dark alley that he's not a threat. And this isn't helped by Randy Thornhill's assertion that men are wired to rape by evolution. My man wrote an entire book about how the trait must have helped its carriers pass the genes down generations, but it got disproved by DNA evidence showing that rapists don't have more children. L for rapists, I guess. In a paper called the Gender Similarities Hypothesis, based on a meta-analysis of 46 meta-analysis papers, available to the author Janet Shibley-Hyde at the time it was written in 2005, it showed that 78% of the gender differences tested showed differences that were close to zero. The main differences that Hyde found that persisted in most contexts were higher male aggressiveness, more frequent masturbation, and openness to non-committed sex. Although sometimes, when put in situations where personal identity were stripped down as much as possible, they'd find that the women were in fact more aggressive than the men. And as a caveat, you also have to consider publication bias. Hyde is only using published studies. There will be a litany of unpublished studies out there which have shown no effect, bringing many of these results much closer to zero. I'm not going to say that gender science is settled and that there are no innate gender differences. I don't think that science will ever be settled. But from what I'm seeing, the better we get at doing fair studies, the more gender differences seem to sort of merge into one another. Gender differences in traits such as 3D rotation, which can be quantified by easily identifiable tests, seem to collapse when you take away stereotype threat or change certain parameters, revealing a much more complex array of differences. I would hazard a prediction to say that it's culture that causes the differences in the expression of the trait, but the underlying trait is innately the same in both genders. Because why would a woman be better at location memory when she incidentally recalls objects on a desk, and worse than a man when she intentionally recalls fake objects in a computer game? There seems to be either a cultural reason for this, or there was simply a quirk in the way the studies were carried out. We'll never know. But it's also interesting that when researchers ask women to show a trait that they're not in any way aware that they're supposed to be doing, their results fall apart in replications with larger sample sizes. The ovulation studies, based on a shaky just so evolutionary theory to start with, suffered from a caveat that doomed them. Women were being studied to see if they carried out actions that they were themselves not aware that they were supposed to be doing. Like, thankfully it's not the done thing to advertise the condition of your cervical mucus to surrounding men to indicate your ovulation status
so no women will have experienced funny looks or social ostracization if they're not wearing red on days 14 to 18 or not performing the estrus special on their shift at the strip club. The same goes with the failed homosexuality hypotheses. They attempted to survey homosexual people to see if they invest more in their siblings' offspring, and they tested multiple other hypotheses for gay people, but none of these hypotheses were along the lines of what we expect culturally of gay people. Or, for instance, the study in which they attempted to explain the female orgasm by hypothesizing that it pair-bonded women with their mates. I mean, they all failed. It's funny that, isn't it? All traits that remain with proven differences are slippery socio-cultural ones that require survey-based self-assessments to quantify, which often fall victim to stereotype bias. The respondents are asking questions through the myopic lens of their self-image within the context of a culture, and are likely to answer questions and act in accordance with what's expected of them. We're increasingly building a pretty substantial consensus that there's actually next to no median difference in any personality trait. And what is there? It's not necessarily genetic. Could it possibly be that the evolutionary psychologists and public intellectuals who have dedicated their careers to a narrative are the ones who don't want to admit an uncomfortable truth? And look, I had to witness this absolute abomination of a Mobb Deep track, which appeared at the start of a Jordan Peterson podcast for some reason, so you have to too.
Sending this one out to my evolutionary psychology people. Yeah, David Buss, Cosmides and Tubi. Yeah, Geoffrey Miller. Yeah, we live in this till the day that we die. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive. That's right, we live in this till the day that we die. Survival of the fit, only the strong survive.
Since I took this shit, you ain't looking so macho. That's a hard pill to swallow, can't tell your IQ by spitting in a tube. So spit on this instead, you nincompoop.
When the idea was first proposed for the Human Genome Project, scientists were pretty excited about the prospect of being able to pinpoint specific genes for specific genetic health conditions, and perhaps, eventually, psychological traits.
With this profound new knowledge, humankind is on the verge of gaining immense new power to heal. It will revolutionize the diagnosis, prevention, and treatment of most, if not all, human diseases. In coming years, doctors increasingly will be able to cure diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, diabetes, and cancer by attacking their genetic roots. In fact, it is now conceivable that our children's children will know the term cancer only as a constellation of stars.
24 years have passed. Scientists were expecting to find a multitude of single gene disorders that they could easily pinpoint, like cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia. But once the sequence was completed, scientists began to realize that it was impossible to point to certain genes or even clusters of genes for specific diseases. There was just no congruence there for most traits. For a start, they were expecting to find around 100,000 genes, but there were only about 20,000 genes there. Nowhere near enough to pinpoint every human ailment, physical trait, and complex behavior. And 90% of those genes are the same as a mouse's. The other 10% appears to be the massive AI penis. What scientists discovered was that these 20 to 25,000 estimated genes were being affected by our DNA in a multitude of different ways. So instead of figuring out the direct cause and effect model of gene to trait, we had to figure out how small variances in DNA molecules were affecting multiple genes and map that information to traits. And this made everything a hell of a lot more difficult than we thought. I don't know about you, but I was told at school that my eye colour was the result of a single gene from my mother and a single gene from my father, and if one was dominant and one was recessive, I'd end up with the dominant trait. If both parents had a recessive gene, I'd end up with the recessive trait. Before embarking on the Human Genome Project, that was how we assumed most traits would work when evolutionary psychology was being established. But no, this simple inheritance model isn't even true for eye colour, and we still don't even know what's happening there for the most part, and that's a trait that's A, easy to measure, unlike any mental trait, and B, unaffected by environment, unlike any mental trait. You could think of it like one person's genome being all of the stars in the universe. There's bloody loads of gene variants in it, and some of them are in constellations that happen to appear together, and some of those constellations are meaningless, but some could increase your chances of having a trait. But some traits require entire galaxies of genes to happen to appear together. But even then, if all of the stars align in that entire galaxy, they're only slightly increasing the chances of that trait appearing. Sometimes more than one galaxy of genes needs to appear. Sometimes it could be 1,000 galaxies. Are you with me? So imagine you wanted to map a trait to specific genes. What you're going to have to do is a lot of population-wide studies to find even a slight statistical significance for a trait. So that would involve collecting genome information from hundreds or thousands of people, all with that same trait. Think of it like collecting the data for a universe of stars, but a separate universe of stars for each person. And because there's so many genes involved in some traits, you're going to have to get thousands of these universes. And for some traits, you're going to need 1 million universes to be able to get the data that you need. And then you pop all of these thousands or millions of universes of genes on top of each other, and you use a very powerful computer to figure out the probability of each star in each universe appearing in congruence with the population's observable trait. And we've got so much longer to go before we even begin to understand what's going on here. One gene variant might only increase your chances of gaining 1 IQ point by a fraction of a percentage. We've found hundreds of genes with varying probability that they will affect your height. And look at the amount of people they needed to even get that far.
I've also been trained by Dr. Buss, who met him in 2014, and we've been very close. He's been an advisor. I sometimes talk to him 3-4 times a week.
Oh yeah, did you know David Buss is now Ty Lopez's evolutionary psychology mentor? There's a crossover no one was expecting and literally no one needs.
IQ is extremely heritable. It's called heritability. It's like 0.78. Height is about the same. But other things like narcissism is almost the same heritability. Anxiety, quick to anger, determination, persistence, it's called conscientiousness.
To even begin to assert that we've found a certain percentage of a trait, especially a psychological trait like IQ, is caused by our genes to a certain specific percent, is wild. We're nowhere near knowing that.
Knowledge.
But don't let that get in the way of your juicy headline about the discovery of a couch potato gene or slut gene, which in that context makes Steven Pinker's list of all of the supposed evolved mind modules that he reckons remain in humans from the Pleistocene look kind of silly to me. Like, funny, I can't see a mind module on there named Boarding Plane with Jeffrey Epstein. Also, I'm just really not buying into all of this mind module stuff. Like, modern humans are constantly doing things that directly goes against what these supposed mind modules would be telling us to do. It was only a few years ago that some woman got her face eaten by a chimp. The don't let chimp rip off my face genes, if they ever did exist, were clearly lost to the entropic sea of genetic shuffling thousands of generations ago. And for that reason alone, I think the way brains work is far more abstract than we even begin to realize. Thanks, chimp lady. And this is just partly why it's actually very worrying, more worrying than it would be, when you see people talk about reviving the eugenics movement, but in a non-Hitlery way. Going back to our mate Chris Williamson and his interview with Dr. Jonathan Anomaly. I don't know why he has given himself that stupid name. It's not his real name. Now, of course, Dr. Anomaly would concede that Nazi eugenics or negative eugenics are bad, but the progression of countries adopting more vigorous social safety nets has resulted in women being more relaxed in their sexual selection practices. After all, they don't have to rely so much on a big, tough macho man to ward off the bears anymore.
The government is essentially the father, and they can basically just get pregnant by whoever, some, muscly dude with no brain. How likely is this guy to stick around, help me raise my family, help actually defend my tribe and my family as a whole and defend me? John Tooby, the evolutionary psychologist, wrote a really cool essay some years ago. It's called The Race Between Germline Gene Editing and Genetic Meltdown. Women don't have incentives to select for the best man in the sense of the most virtuous, the smartest, the most creative, because the government is essentially solving the problems that a male would have been tasked with solving.
So of course, this is leading to less desirable traits being increasingly selected for in men. Shit! So how can we stop this? Well, science! Allow people to select embryos based on genetic traits and breed macho genes back into the population that way.
But the net effect of that has to be that we're accumulating deleterious mutations such that essentially, since we don't have purifying selection anymore, we're going to build these up, and that will lead to a kind of slow genetic meltdown unless we have ways of editing those out or using embryo selection to select them out.
Well, there's a few problems with that, apart from the obvious. For a start, he doesn't even seem to have a basic understanding of genetic science.
But yeah, we can get these like genetic inequalities either through, again, hypergamy or polygamy, but you can also get them through assortative mating, and we're already doing it. Even before you have gene editing or embryo selection, which has just come online, what we've had is increased genetic inequality in the last century. Why would we have that? Well, women's education.
Bro, what? How? What? What?
So what you can now do is assign a set of polygenic risk scores to those embryos and select the one in accordance with whatever it is that you want. So couples are going to select probably some more for health than intelligence. Some maybe care more about intelligence. Eventually it's going to be personality and even political orientation, which are to some degree heritable.
No, we are nowhere near being able to do that.
It's really the viability of doing embryo selection in a more fine-grained way than ever before that's kind of bringing back the debate on eugenics and genetic enhancement.
Oh, but he recognizes that if this goes too far, we could develop a genetic elite between the people who can afford the embryo trait selection and an underclass, and it may even get to the point where we have two human subspecies unable to mate with each other.
I think like we should enable the poor to use this. We can't stop the rich from doing it because they'll go somewhere else to do it if we try to stop them. And we should learn to live with inequality. And if we get inequalities that are so big that we can't cooperate anymore, this is not like my hope or my dream, this is just my prediction. At that point, we essentially speciate in the same way that chimpanzees are now different than bonobos. They're very closely related, but they actually behave pretty differently. Bonobos are more peaceful than chimpanzees, and they basically don't live together.
But on top of that, if you even take a quick glance at Johnny's papers, you'll find enlightening quotes such as this.
The current demographics of Western countries are troubling, as people with a higher IQ, more education, and greater income reproduce at relatively low levels. Some have suggested paying people who would make good parents to have children. Sweden has among the most generous paid parental leave laws in the world, and it is among the few developed countries with a replacement birth rate. Some studies suggest that family leave laws are the primary reason for its demographic stability, but the evidence is tainted by the fact that native-born Swedes have below replacement fertility, and foreign-born immigrants from Somalia have more children, thus bringing Sweden close to replacement levels. This makes the effect of family leave laws a little unclear.
So I don't know, Chris, either you don't even do the slightest research on the people you decide to platform, or you do and you're just far too dumb to understand their papers, or maybe you do understand them and you're a Nazi. 3 options there, and none of them are good. In this video, Diana attempts to change the meaning of the word eugenics to promote it as unharmful. It's actually something women have always done by choosing who to mate with and taking actions which affect their baby.
If I could feed my child something when they were young that would give them a 20% decreased cancer risk, or if I could read them some book that would increase their IQ, I think everybody would be in favor of it. I don't think it's much of a stretch to say that reproductive technology is going to enable those beautiful sentiments to have the best possible life for your child.
So you agree? You like eugenics? Diana advocates for positive eugenics, which is encouraging people of high IQ to have children rather than discouraging people of low IQ. She then happily dedicates a few sentences of this short lecture to give a shout out to past Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew.
Things like Lee Kuan Yew, the Prime Minister of Singapore, holding cruises to introduce college-educated men and women in the hopes that they would have children who would be more likely to be intelligent and pave the way for the future of Singapore.
Sounds great, right? I don't know if the happy-go-lucky music in the background of this video is affecting the way I perceive the information within. I mean, everything went fine in Singapore when they implemented positive eugenics. They implemented tax rebates and school placements for the people they wanted to procreate, but they quickly realised that this didn't create as much of an effect as they predicted. Damn. So then they began trying different tactics, like very lightly pushing birth control onto poorer citizens, marketed as anti-poverty measures. But then they realised that this was still not enough, so they started giving poor people who never passed junior high school $4,000 as a down payment on a shitty government apartment if they agreed to sterilisation. Positive eugenics! But how did Singapore get to this point? Well, in an attempt to convince the public that it was a good idea, the Prime Minister cited twin study research by a certain Cyril Burt, which had proven psychological traits were 80% heritable.
Anyone subjected to such a media barrage could hardly avoid the impression that a high degree of consensus existed within scientific circles, and that the predominant role of genes in IQ determination was a demonstrated scientific truth. This was an impression so much at variance with the current state of the debate that the conspicuous silence of local academics and professionals was most unfortunate in reinforcing this erroneous picture. This was all the more so in light of the devastating critiques in the 70s of practically the entire body of empirical data, as well as the theoretical edifice which had been offered in support of the hereditarian position.
All of this sounds scarily premonitory now, doesn't it? But also, you don't even need to ponder the potential future of positive eugenics to realise, moral and ethical quandaries aside, that it wouldn't work.
It's one thing to deploy eugenics on ideological, political, moral grounds. It is quite another to conclude that it wouldn't work in practice. Of course it would. It works for cows, horses, pigs, dogs, and roses. Why on earth wouldn't it work for humans? Facts ignore ideology.
Sure, we could technically breed people that we've currently culturally deemed as having desirable traits. Perhaps we could breed out the being edgy on Twitter trait, but you have to consider the consequences. Evolutionary psychologists hold the outdated belief that traits, especially psychological traits, can be bred in or out of humans in much the same way that we breed behaviours into dogs, disregarding the fact that humans have much more complex brains than dogs. We tend to anthropomorphize animals, giving them human traits, such as desperately trying to get cats to learn English by pressing buttons and associating them with human meaning. Your cat is not talking to you, Karen. They're desperately pressing random buttons to get your attention because you clearly get upset or ignore them otherwise. Let your cat be a cat.
We introduced the button for mad actually as her third word. She picked it up extremely fast.
In the opposite direction, we tend to animalize humans, but the largest differences between us and animals reside in our brains. Attempting to breed behaviors into human brains in the way that we attempt to breed behaviors into dogs also negates the fact that purebred dogs suffer from a multitude of genetic ailments, which only serves to prove that attempting to breed in certain psychological traits within a human population would only increase the chances of us ending up with more genetic mental illnesses. Adam Rutherford's book about eugenics fully explains this and why eugenics is a bad idea and doesn't work. Rutherford is a geneticist, a genetic scientist. But what does Geoffrey Miller, an evolutionary psychologist, call this book? Woke nonsense. What's Geoffrey Miller's explanation for traits like schizophrenia? Well, he reckons that genes that give you rizz with the ladies, when taken to their extreme, can culminate in traits like schizophrenia. But shit. DNA evidence has scuppered the just so story again. Relatives of people with schizophrenia don't have more children than people who don't. Smaller studies show that they did, but further larger studies showed that they didn't. Where have we seen that happen before? Got an explanation for everything, have you, Geoffrey? Can you explain Cat Bin Lady, Geoffrey? Is she an example of an Icarus of Riz genes, Geoffrey? You see, men are attracted to trash pussy up to a point, but when those genes go too far, this happens. Recent genome-wide association studies have revealed certain gene variants which only increase the chances of developing schizophrenia by a fraction of a percentage point. Environment appears to remain a largely influential factor. During the eugenicist campaign of Nazi Germany, Hitler attempted to eradicate schizophrenia from the gene pool. And how well did that work? Well, by the time 1975 rolled around, schizophrenia rates had pretty much returned to pre-war numbers. I know I don't really need to sell anyone on the fact that genocide is not good, but just to be clear, it also genetically doesn't fucking work. Are schizophrenia's Riz genes really so sexy, Geoffrey, that women selected it back into the German population in the space of like 2 generations? Or do you reckon there might be something else going on here? What we've actually learned from genome-wide association studies is how far away we truly are from developing any kinds of treatments for many physical disorders, never mind the much harder to diagnose psychological disorders. But the far more prescient question is, should we? It's almost as if through learning about our genes, what we're actually learning is that we shouldn't mess with anything, ever, no matter how much we learn.
Well, as one biological anthropologist, I think this was Irv DeVore at Harvard, he said men are one long breeding experiment run by women. Basically one of the things that one of my first studies, the 37 culture study, documented is that women have a universal preference for men with resources.
From what we know, women aren't the allegorical eugenicists choosing the traits they like, and now they're all on the pill. They don't like masculine men, so now they're breeding a dystopia of Timothee Chalamet's and the West is gonna fall or whatever the fuck. The fact that the rate of schizophrenia seems to resolutely remain in the population at 1% suggests that it's there for a function of survival and group fitness. We may culturally see it as a defect from the norm, but what if it's not? What if it's the environment that we're giving these genes that causes them to express in a negative way? Why should the genes that predispose us to these conditions, either directly or when combined with environmental factors, remain in the population at the same rate throughout generations? If there weren't some kind of benefit, perhaps they're functioning as a kind of trade-off for a more socially beneficial trait. Diagnosis rates for schizophrenia remain at about 1% of the population, suggesting that in an entirely different environment, perhaps one where people are properly cared for, these exact genes could in fact express themselves completely differently. They could produce geniuses that cure cancer in first period and then execute a radical kickflip at lunch. It seems that if women are predominantly selecting for anything, they're selecting for variation. They're doing anti-eugenics. Men aren't cleverer than women, and women aren't cleverer than men. We're all stupid. And biology is cleverer than all of us. Okay, so I've been trying to think of the best way to explain how genetic variance works. So you have traits that are 100% heritable and traits that are 0% heritable, but most of them are somewhere in between. So the trait of you having 2 legs is 0% heritable. Even though you technically inherited your 2 legs from your parents, you were going to have those 2 legs, regardless of who gave birth to you. But how long those 2 legs are, to a certain percent, is decided by your genes, and to a certain percent, decided by your environment. So it could be somewhere between 60 and 70%, we don't actually know. We can't even settle the science on that one. And that's a trait that's pretty easy to measure. So the variance in psychological traits like IQ or sexuality are harder to measure accurately, but we can see that they are highly varied, which suggests that they're pretty heritable, but also influenced by the environment. So I'm talking about variance in heritable traits here. This is the first few humans that ever happened. They somehow evolved from various ancestors many, many, many years ago. So what we had initially was quite a small population, and the first humans that were around were pretty inbred, but over time the population increased, and so they got less and less inbred, and the variance within the heritable traits increased over time. Now, if some sort of epidemic or natural disaster comes along that only some members of the population survive because they had the beneficial genes for surviving that particular disaster, what you get is a genetic bottleneck because only those genes survived the disaster. So what you get here is the species being a little bit inbred again for a while, but then over time, as the population increases again, so do the heritable traits. But then, oh no, guess what? An entirely different disaster comes along. And now a small subsection of people with different genes survive it. Like, maybe for some reasons aliens come down to Earth and decide to kill everyone who doesn't have eczema. And finally, my eczema genes come in useful and I end up saddled with the job of repopulating Earth with all of my flaky friends. And we have lots of flaky sex. And then, over time, the variance in heritable traits increases again. So humans have done a really great job of surviving for a long time. We haven't experienced any genetic bottlenecks for a long time. And what's our number one trait? Our brains. So you would expect to see the most variance of all coming from the traits in our brains, the ones we can't see. So this is why when you measure genetic variance of any trait within a human population, you'll see there's more variance within the population than between any groups of it. I mean, most of the time it's going to be a lot closer than that, but this is just to illustrate. You're going to see a lot more variance within that population than you will see of any difference between the two populations. Because that's just how statistics works when you have millions and millions of people and they're all creating as much variance as possible within that population. Any small differences that you do see between the means could be some kind of environmental factor, or it could just be chance, which is called genetic drift. But you'll generally see as much variance as possible within a population for heritable traits. So we may see within heritable traits some expressions of that trait being expressed more than others, such as the differences that we observe between generally the way that men and women act. But this, I believe, is just the variance being influenced by culture. So this variance interacts with our human necessity to be social because we need to interact to reason with each other. But as cultures change over time, so does the way that our varied genetic traits interact with that culture. For example, a man who's quite happy being gay in today's society only 50 years ago might have been happily married to a woman and had kids and never really questioned his sexuality. Of course, some people 50 years ago were very unhappily closeted as well. The same goes with trans people, the same goes for any trait that we would have deemed out of the norm for its time. It's all about how your genetics interact with your environment. So biology creates variance in preparation for any shit that might come its way. Variance is the robustness of a species. It also helps us organize. Different people are good at doing different things, and this allows us to help each other to create an economy and do all of the amazing things that humans do. Okay, so that's the way it works. This is how evolutionary psychologists think this works. The species starts out with a small amount of variance in heritable traits, and over time, in a heritable trait like sexuality, it got less and less varied, until we reached a point of perfection during some time in the Ice Age called the EEA, the era of evolutionary adaptedness. And when we reached this point of perfection in these traits, since then, it's just been the same. All variants that we see outside of this, i.e. gay people or any traits deemed not sexually attractive to the other gender, are a paradox to be explained away in ways that make them beneficial to this time here. So, are you gay? Then perhaps these risk genes just went too far, or perhaps you were helping out with the children of your very straight siblings, or perhaps you're just desperate because you can't get anyone of the opposite gender. There's no evidence for any of this. They haven't found evidence for any of it. They've just decided that that's the case, and they're working backwards from it and doing mental gymnastics to get there. It's been estimated that only 8.2% of our genome is a result of natural selection. The rest is variation, which is genes you have completely by random chance. There was a famous episode of Who Do You Think You Are, where British actor Danny Dyer discovered he was directly descended from King Edward III. Geneticist Adam Rutherford, in his book How to Argue with a Racist, explains rather cynically, backed up with mathematical calculations, that all British people are related to King Edward III in some way or another. Saying you have someone's blood or genes doesn't really mean anything once you've gone even a few generations back. This runs contrary to our widely held beliefs about ancestry and family trees, the assumption that we hold many of the same genes as our direct ancestors, but this is not the case. Genes are engineered by biology to create as much variance as possible to prepare for new cultures or bottlenecking events, meaning the genetic profile of your ancestors doesn't really have much bearing on how you turned out. Environments and cultures can change much quicker than natural selection has the time to adapt to. We only recently discovered epigenetics, which works on top of our genome, making immediate changes to our genes so that they respond to the environment around us. And we're even building evidence that some epigenetic changes to our genome are passed on to our children directly, such as trauma. But the evidence behind this one is not yet concrete enough for me to say that this is a definite scientific fact. In terms of skin colour, you could think of it like your ancestors' genes all pouring a shade of paint into a pot and your genome picking an option based on the choice it is given. But with mental traits, it's like all of your ancestors had an entire deck of thousands of cards, each card representing a small percentage of a mental trait, and each card interacts with the other cards, and when they're passed down through generations, each time 2 packs of these thousands of cards get shuffled together with another, and then your individual genome and your environment picks which cards out of those thousands and thousands of different cards it wants to express. That means there's a lot more information there to create variance within a population. So, with each generation, a larger amount of variance occurs than you'd see within skin colour. Humans are a very visual species, and skin colour is the most striking, obvious visual trait, along with gender. But conflating simple visual traits with complex invisible traits is a trap scholars throughout history have fallen into. It's this kind of thinking that has led to racist assumptions in the past, which have been used to justify slavery. I think evolutionary psychologists fall into this trap with gender. Gender is a very visual trait which our culture has then thrown stereotypes onto and amplified, so they assume mental traits must work in the same way. It actually makes no evolutionary sense for mental traits to be wired in any way. It makes no sense for all evolution to happen from the perspective of the survival of a gene. For biology to work around the goal of creating a genetic bottleneck by itself would be idiotically counterproductive. It would be self-sabotaging. It makes evolutionary sense for biology to create as much variance as possible in preparation for whatever environment or culture might come next. Consider the most recent cycles of culture that we've been through. Unironically, I often think about the Roman Empire. Male gay sex was essentially an extremely masculine thing to do, as long as you were the top. And have you seen Pompeii? They literally drew dicks on the tops of doorways everywhere. Like, you couldn't enter a food hall in that place without being subjected to 5 huge drawings of scrotums and a mural of some woman being monster munched on the wall. If we'd had behavioural scientists going around with their surveys during that era, how different do you think the results would have been in regards to how many men perceived themselves as queer in some way? Or how about ancient Greece? This was was the time of the widespread belief about the 4 humours. So women were seen as wetter than men, which essentially meant that they were more susceptible to their animalistic desires than the more stoic men. Along with this, they believed that the women were unable to control their sexuality, and it was up to the men to control the women's desires. Kinky. What would the surveys have said then? What would the Chris Williamson podcast have been like in medieval times?
But yet what art we going to do about these wenches? Be they not witches? We did want to receiveth to the facts and logic of those wenches by way of a survey, yet the wenches all hath said nay. Whence at which hour we did reduce our sample size to wenches suspected of sorcery, and taken to trial. They were all deceased of drowning, so it was concluded 100% of the wench folk are, in fact, witches. What causes the hags to forswear so readily they are not witches? Is 't something from the times we resided in caves, hunters and gatherers? Would seemeth so. Fascinating.
I'm going to talk for a second about bias in evolutionary psychology and how it fundamentally exposes the way that evolutionary psychologists just don't understand the way the brain works. When analysing the Google coder James Damore, Geoffrey Miller describes him as kind of aspy.
James Damore is kind of aspy. He loves systematizing information. He's not naturally that empathic with people of other views. He can be a bit blunt in how he says things. James Damore is factually correct about most of his claims about sex differences.
As far as I know, he's never met Damore, but his view is that Damore's aspy, systematizing personality led him to write a memo which was purely based on facts of human evolution. He just didn't know how to present it in a way that took other people's feelings into account. He was too focused on the facts that he got from 2 Wikipedia pages. He applies this personality trait to himself too.
And I'm just aspy. So it's all easy. I mean, I'm very rational, I'm very systematizing, I seek out principled solutions to issues, things that make sense. I hate inconsistency, I hate hypocrisy.
He believes his neurodivergence has logically raised him above others by removing the emotional haze through which everybody else sees the world. So completely unemotional, systematizing Geoffrey wrote an essay called Political Peacocks, in which he starts out by observing some other students at his university taking part in a sit-in to protest for the university's divestment from stocks that do business in South Africa, which at the time was enacting apartheid.
I was puzzled by the spontaneity, ardor, and near unanimity of the student demands for divestment. Why would mostly white, mostly middle-class North Americans miss classes, risk jail, and occupy a drab office building for 2 weeks in support of political freedom for poor blacks living in a country 6,000 miles away?
The students, according to Geoffrey, were more interested in meeting people with a similar ideology as themselves to mate, essentially using the sit-in as a speed dating event. Political peacocking. He offers evidence that everyone he knew was dating someone from the sit-in. Ah yes, Geoffrey, always laser focused on the facts. Are you systematizing here, Geoffrey, or did you just not care about black people 6,000 miles away? Geoffrey's so laser focused on the facts that he can immediately tell when someone's virtue signaling on Twitter. He even wrote a book on it. Of course, it's only happening when someone disagrees with Geoffrey's political views. Funny that. Well, I guess you're the expert.
I say, people trying to ban guns who don't know anything at all about guns won't be persuasive to people who do know about guns. No constructive dialogue is possible when one side is proudly ignorant, arrogantly patronizing, and high on its own virtue signaling. Why are you supporting woke gender ideology? What does any of this have to do with car insurance? Have you really thought through the implications of letting your Gen Z interns dictate your company's virtue signaling? Anti-wokeness is opposition to pretentious hegemonic elites maintaining their deeply unequal power through pseudo-egalitarian Virtue signaling? I don't have gender pronouns in my Twitter bio. You do. So who cares more about pronouns? The person who's simply not using them? Or the person who's virtue signaling with them? You'd sacrifice relations with your own flesh and blood just because they don't share your passion for some trendy political virtue signaling. Sad. Short-sighted and sad.
I don't know. Seems quite emotional to me, Geoffrey. Trans people don't come under Diana Fleischman's constructed view of reality, so she creates just so stories to explain them away. She thinks that young people just can't accept the fact that people like her are able to explain them, and it just goes against their ideology, so they decide they're going to opt out completely.
I think that some people choose an identity based on their ideology. So I think that there are many people who think that sex differences research is fascistic or oppressive or biologically determinist, and they choose to identify as gender nonconforming or non-binary in the service of that goal. People don't want to be put in a category. They don't want to they have problems with all the measures that you give them. They don't like to say that they do things one way or another, that they feel one way consistently or another way. Because I think fundamentally, right now, as psychology progresses, you're going to see more and more that people are trying to avoid and fight against being understood. And I think that's part of the rise of the whole, non-binary thing.
So many people who are non-binary are doing it for sort of moral or culture reasons. They want to make it seem more normal to not think about or to not bin people as male or female.
Yes.
So maybe that's a problem that you think is important, that people don't stereotype on the basis of sex, and that's one reason that you've become non-binary, is because you want to take that on as an identity.
And Jess, you could say, but you're utilising bias when you come to your variance for group fitness theory, and yes, I do concede that you could be correct, but I also don't have to concoct 29 conflicting just so stories to come to my conclusion. There's no paradoxes I have to resolve, there's just one biological narrative, and I have growing scientific consensus on my side. But sure, my bias is involved, and you can decide on whether you fully or partially agree or totally disagree. I ain't your brain parasite. I'm not gonna implant myself inside you and make you crawl to the top of a piece of grass and get eaten. Maybe. But we struggle doing this. We all do. The brain doesn't tend to do a good job of analysing itself. And the reason for that is the very universal mechanism that makes our brains so adaptive. Bias. Emotions are logic, and science is not truth. Despite what Ben Shapiro may tell you about feelings and what Huberman might tell you about science between texting his 5 girlfriends, nobody is fully logical in the way that they think. That would be impossible. Consider a game of chess. With every move taken, the possible outcomes to that move could be, say, 10. It's whiteboard time again. What do pawns look like? So when you're playing chess, you're considering the outcomes of the move that you're about to make. Say there's 10 possible outcomes. So with every move taken, the possible outcomes to that move could be about 10. You can sort of imagine it like a dialogue tree with a branching factor of 10. So a whole new different set of things could happen every time you choose to do something. And your opponent, for each outcome of that, could do about 10 further things. So every single possible outcome of this move has another 10 possible outcomes coming out of the end of that outcome. Bang, 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 bang. So if you decided you didn't want to make your brain analyze the entire future of this chess game and you wanted a big computer to do it instead, then you'd have to get this supercomputer to do something like analyze 1 million chessboard outcomes every second to try and analyze the probability of the best move to take according to how the game would logically turn out. It would actually take the supercomputer 32,000 years. And that's only if you wanted to look 18 moves ahead in the chess game. Now imagine trying to calculate every outcome
of each proposed solution to, say, climate change. It's impossible. No conceivable future computer would ever be able to do that, which is why AI developers are actually attempting to build models which actually imitate the brain by using heuristic algorithms. Essentially, they're trying to program it to disregard certain options outright because it's not worth considering them. That's mind-blowing, isn't it? Like, we're trying to make computers emulate human emotion so that they can think better. And then that leads on to a question. A computer is never going to experience a true human emotion. It's never going to be truly upset that it got something wrong or truly happy that it got something right. So will it ever be able to think as well as we can? And that's one reason why effective altruism is stupid, because those guys definitely haven't already done the maths for that. But that's another insane rabbit hole for another insane time.
No! No, don't do it!
To deal with this combinatorial explosion problem, our brains use emotion to hugely cut down the amount of available options and employ some degree of rationality based on a trade-off between facts and vibes. You might be able to see the possible outcomes of your next chess move, but anything beyond that is vibes, based on your bias, your personal experience of playing chess. We don't all have the same experiences, but the amazing thing about human brains is it's evolved to be social so we can reason with each other. So this circle is a population of people. Perfect. This population has to make a decision about how to organize society. You're just one little dot. There are many dots in here that are all wrong. Ben Shapiro is this dot. He's got a big dot. But all we're doing in this big circle is drawing from our own personal experiences and vibes. And we've all got different little circles of experiences and vibes, and some of them overlap. So if women were actively sexually selecting for only some parts of this big reasoning pie, for example, then we'd be actively weakening our chances of survival as a species. In my opinion, as long as we survive as a species and our sexuality is part of our psyche, however it expresses itself, babies are going to happen somehow and somewhere anyway. We're not struggling to reproduce. We're pretty horny. What's more urgent, actually, is navigating environmental changes that could wipe us all out at once, such as, for instance, climate change. Ironically, Francis Galton, the inventor of eugenics, noticed and demonstrated this phenomenon himself. He asked patrons of a farmer's market to guess the weight of an ox and took the median of all the guesses, and it was within 1% of the ox's weight. How he discovered this and then went on to advocating removing certain people from the gene pool who would have helped the population come to that correct estimation, I don't know, because if anything, Galton was one of the first to demonstrate the importance of representation and diversity, the amazing abilities of the full spectrum of human cognitive variance, and it's based on vibes. If someone's arguing with you, telling you you're stuck in your feelings, they're actually giving you a compliment. If they're only looking at the facts, bro, it means their brain.x isn't functioning properly, and they've tried to perform too many actions at once, and they would have started having a fit on the floor some time ago. The more different types of people who make sure that they have their voice heard in this circle, the more likely we're gonna end up in the right place. Our dumb brains tend to work off mostly visual context cues to understand the world around it, even if there's no actual evidence for this belief. That's why stereotypes are so prevalent. World leaders and CEOs are all men, therefore me dumb brain think all men have innate capacity to be world leader and CEO. But this stupid mechanism can also work in the other direction, for our benefit. So if we put people of colour, LGBT people, or women as protagonists in traditionally male-dominated video games, for example, it will make young girls, LGBT people, and people of colour see it and think, I could do that too.
Wish I could be like me.
And yes, it would trigger people in the process.
Fucking pronouns!
But in the long run, for the sake of diversity, in all walks of life, and literally for human reasoning, it's worth it. Especially in science. Science is full of old,
White men, most of the women are white as well, who, whether they would like to admit it or not, are biased, and it's sending science in one wrong direction. And this video has made that abundantly clear.
So you get these evolved gender differences between men and women, their personality, and then you change the gender composition of an institution, and it can fundamentally change the goal of what that institution's trying to accomplish. Among psychology professors, men are more supportive of pursuit of truth as like the purpose of science than women are. They're more supportive of academic freedom than women are, whereas women think we need to be balancing these things with moral concerns and harm concerns.
Having more women in academia will not send science away from logic and towards feelings. We confuse heavy scientific bias with some sort of tangible truth that we all yearn for. And this runs deep, especially in right-wing media. Essentialist reasoning is a trap that the right often falls into.
If there are only two categories, male and female, and you say that female now is in this category, there are no definitions. There are no definitions. I mean, to paraphrase my friend Matt Walsh, I'm gonna need you to explain what a woman is without reference to the word woman.
You cannot accurately describe a woman without using the term woman, and in the same way, you cannot accurately describe a cat without using the term cat. Somebody might come up to me and say, "Why do you think Brooklyn is a cat?" And I'd say, "Well, he's got pointy ears and whiskers and fur and toe beans," but I've also just described a dog. Before Darwin, scholars viewed the animal kingdom in essentialist terms. All species had a list of certain traits that made them the species that they are. Deviations from these essences were an error. But Darwin actually discovered that in all species, these deviations are in fact the norm. What we define as a species is at best a statistical average of all the traits we associate with that species. But this doesn't just apply to animals, it applies to most concepts we think of as logically definable. Like, how do I know that Brooklyn is a cat? How do I know I haven't been feeding a dog for the past 7 years? Well, my brain is doing thousands of calculations at once to come to a statistical summary of my life experiences of catness and making a decision based on that. Emotions are heavily involved in this process because my brain has to come to a conclusion of his catness. Otherwise, I'd go insane and I'd start throwing balls at him thinking he'll bring them back. Maybe he is just a shit dog, but my emotions are telling me that he's a cat, so I'm gonna go with it. The propensity for scholars to think in essentialist terms is exactly what's wrong with much of modern science. This is the error that Shapiro makes when he looks at a woman. His little synapses are firing through all of the cultural experiences of womanness he's had throughout his life, and he's using his emotions, his feelings, to come to his conclusion, and he's working back from this conclusion to tell himself he's using logic based on chromosomes or genitals. He's not. He's just dumb. We cannot escape emotion. Emotion and bias, with a little bit of logic, a tiny little sprinkling of logic, is literally how reasoning works. But evolutionary psychologists and many people who know what a woman is don't realise this. Watch any podcast with Gad Saad and he will literally describe any opinion he doesn't agree with as an idea pathogen. Like, he literally believes there's a woke mind virus.
So they will say things like, well, you know, evolutionary psychology, it's pseudoscience. Yeah, you're a moron. Probably the granddaddy of all of these idea pathogens would be postmodernism, because postmodernism, if you'd like, is the negation of the scientific method. It's the negation that there is a truth with capital T that is out there to be discovered. Humans suffer not only from actual brain worms in the same way that the mouse does, but we suffer from another class of idea pathogens, and those are actual ideas that are parasitic.
Saad isn't even a psychologist. He just decided to apply evolutionary psychology to marketing for an easy, plausible sounding way to tell companies that it's easy to market to different demographics because they're wired differently. So you just have to know what they were doing in caveman times. It seems Saad's obsession with objective truth is a sort of overcorrection coat because his entire profession is based on extremely shaky scientific ground. And when David Busk
Sachs goes on the Joe Rogan Experience, his extremely shaky research, again, is taken as objective truth because it's labelled as science, and because Rogan decided it fitted in better with his little slice of the vibes pie.
That's what's disturbing to me, is this sort of wholesale acceptance of this denial, where we're deciding that there is no difference, and that these differences are cultural, these differences are purely brought upon by the patriarchal society to try to suppress members of the opposite sex, and it doesn't back up with science.
Yeah. I'm a scientist, and so you go with the data. I object to and find abhorrent the infusion of ideology into the science.
The underrepresentation of minorities in science has led to a bias which is only masquerading as a truth. And when that's paired with a science like psychology, which is still clearly in its infancy, we're left with a combinatorial explosion of lies, manipulation, and bias. Multiply that with the profitability of supposed neuroscientists giving their opinion and saying that it's based on bulletproof empirical evidence. What science is actually doing for us right now, at least, is generating more questions than answers. We are discovering that sex is literally a spectrum, and in our minds, gender identity is a real thing and a separate spectrum from our culturally defined masculine or feminine personality traits. A government cannot decide what real science is and tell academics to fall in line. But if biased science is able to masquerade as a truth, it's easier for its proponents to make it seem like their side is already winning the argument. You're the stoic, logical side pointing backwards at a tangible view of the past and conflating is with ought, and then leaning back and laughing at your hysterical opposition.
If these supposedly stoic dudes, obsessed with facts and logic, were really devoid of emotion, they would have no drive to argue with you in the first place. The pursuit of truth comes from an emotional response to being wrong or right. If you're not exhibiting humility, like even acknowledging that there's a chance that you could be incorrect, that, in a way, is the most emotional, hysterical response of all. Evolutionary psychology, for a field so up in arms about its supposed censorship, whilst getting interviewed constantly on the largest podcasts in the world, what they're doing is taking part in a more insidious, covert form of censorship. Women are too emotional to be scientists. They're taking hormones that are putting them in a fugue state. People with progressive viewpoints are infected by idea pathogens. They're only virtue signaling to each other. They don't really have that opinion. It's not worth listening to them. They're crazy. It's in their genes. In fact, maybe they need breeding out. This isn't censorship. It's worse than that. It's dehumanization.
As I've said and you've said, there's no such thing as my truth, right? There's your opinion and then there's the truth.
Well, call me a wokey woke, Benny boy, but I actually do believe there is no the truth. Societally, we create a constantly changing truth. Shapiro conflates observable truths, such as 2 + 2 = 4, with social truths. The right will imply that the left is attempting to change observable mathematical truths when we're only trying to change the consistently malleable social ones. Women's rights are being chipped away. First it's abortion, then it's the birth control pill. What's next? Are they going to take our vibrators away from us? You always have the people who look to the past and go, well, that worked fine, didn't it? They'll walk up to women on the street and say, gay son or thought daughter, because they want to hear that immediate gut reaction. This is only an expression of what's expected of them, though. And culture is so strong, it sometimes doesn't feel like a choice. But it is. Increasingly, these viewpoints do not reflect the ways people actually act. Talking about how you want society to change is just the first step. But to be honest, call me an idiot, but I believe we'll get there. In fact, what we can see from history, if we look back into the past far beyond the 1950s, is that we are, as humans, masters of morphing into the cultures that we create. I'm not going to sit here and say that I've got the solution to all of this. I'm not that narcissistic. Everything starts with awareness. Just please, let's do something before the human race splits in two, one with the ability to afford CRISPR gene editing technology and the other a sort of lowly goblin-like proletariat suited only for work cleaning the teat-cups in Jordan Peterson's milking factory. Before long, the elite species will have sequenced Elon Musk's entire genome and injected his DNA into many consecutive generations, so much so that the genetic pool on the future Mars colony will have just been reduced to a population of deformed fishmen with transparent skin and barrel torsos, and after interbreeding with each other enough times, ending up creating a sort of genetic abomination somewhat resembling a blobfish that starts suffocating when not in the signal range of a Starlink satellite. Yet, the cursed creature will be considered the pinnacle of human evolution. Despite only being able to communicate by making wet fart noises, people will flock to it far and wide for advice. The promised trickle-down eugenics wealth distribution will never make it back to Earth. A black market will emerge due to the goblin people's desperation for elite DNA. Geoffrey Miller's semen will be handed out in rations. Oh, I can never remember where those down berries are. Wait a minute. What is this? Well, better see if it's poisonous.
I don't know what it's doing to me. I took one pill, now I've got a PhD. I've hit the wall and I can't concentrate. I'm in a sort of hormonal fugue state. I need an emotional man to penetrate. I need a neurotic boy to satiate. I don't know if I'm straight bi or gay. I just know that I want Timothee Chalamet. His painted nails are radical, his demeanor theatrical. No blonde hair on his mandible, my oil with him is vaginal.
When he is ejaculated up to a certain extent.
We'll dismantle hierarchies, build an estrogenocy. A master of androgyny, a cockle for my progeny.
When he is ejaculated up to a certain extent.
My birth control pill's passion, my baby-faced assassin. As dainty as a feather, will destabilize the West together.
When he is ejaculated up to a certain extent.
I don't know what it's doing to me. I took one pill, now I've got a PhD. I've hit the wall and I can't concentrate. I'm in a sort of hormonal fugue state. I need an emotional man to penetrate. I need a neurotic boy to satiate. I don't know if I'm straight bi or gay. I just know that I want Timothee Chalamet.
hope you enjoyed that journey into insanity. But now to take you back out of insanity, I'm going to take a second to tell you about Nebula. Nebula is the type of platform all creators wish they really had in an ideal world, not ravaged by big tech and
Say the line, Bart!
late-stage capitalism. It's owned by me and my creator friends. It's like a little playground where we can upload whatever we want. We don't have to worry about algorithms or demonetization at all. Nebula is a platform I'm building with other creators as a place where we can elevate ourselves to a level above what we were previously capable of, and it's quickly becoming the most interesting, fastest growing independent video platform on the internet. Nebula has produced exclusives like Lindsay Ellis's Ballad of John and Yoko, which dives deep into the unintended consequences of the murder of John Lennon. It's a beautiful video exploring one of the strangest stories in modern music history, and I especially loved the section where she explored infantilized male geniuses and the women who ruined them, where she compares the attitudes towards Yoko Ono to the hostility towards Courtney Love, Amber Heard and Meghan Markle. They also have really interesting shows like the in-depth geopolitics show Modern Conflicts, or Jet Lag, which is a travel game show where the players use the literal real world as their sandbox. It's a really unique concept which is so exciting and wouldn't be possible without Nebula. We're even producing a film called Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend that got covered in Variety, one of the most popular entertainment magazines in the world. Basically, Nebula is becoming the answer to the question, how do you make art and content that is as high quality and interesting as traditional media without the corruption and exploitation associated with that industry? You can watch all of my content ad and sponsor free, as well as all of these awesome other creators, including Big Joel, H Bomber Guy, and Philosophy Tube. You can even watch Abigail's Nebula original, The Prince, which is only available on Nebula, nowhere else, not on any other website, in fact, not even in your nan's garden. Well, only if you signed up for Nebula, then got on your nan's Wi-Fi, then sat in a garden to watch it. We've even got a bajillion new originals divided into 2 categories, fact and fiction, and loads more originals on the way. We've got news run by TLDR News, culture, that's me, science, history, podcasts, and classes. And because we're a platform full of self-loathing creators, one of our most recent additions is Man Carrying Thing, who actively is taking the piss out of video essayists who put skits in their videos. It's really funny. We also have a lifetime promotion right now, which means with a one-off payment of $300 you can have Nebula for as long as you and Nebula exists, which is a great option for people who A, don't like monthly payments, and B, would like to help us grow this platform so we can invest more money into amazing, original, high-budget content. We've already got some great ones on the way, including Identities by Jessie Gender and Dracula's Ex-Girlfriend by Abigail of Philosophy Tube, which is coming later this summer. So use my link because of course you want to support me primarily, but you'll also be supporting all of these really cool guys. Alright, thank you, bye!
Timothee! I love you! Amber, Lily, Anna, Menti, Mistral, Bradley, Horatio, Van Acker, BK, Nets, Fine, Caleb, Holmes, Armitage, Lundus, Captures, Wank,